The blood moon rose 37 days ago. Since that night, the world has lived by a single law. You must never stand still. Anything that remained motionless after sunset attracted the hunters. No one knew where they came from. All they knew was that they sensed stillness. They could strip a house full of sleeping people in an hour, a tent camp in 10 minutes. They hardly touched a moving car. That's why the cities died first. That's why the roads became the only home for the living. The city of Ashford was living out its last day. The city council had gathered everything that could run at the stadium. 400 vehicles for 8,000 people. The allocation was by lottery. Ray Coulter had been standing in line since dawn. He was 24. Before the moon, he'd worked as a mechanic at the port. He'd taken apart ship diesel engines and decommissioned cranes. His hands remembered iron better than people's faces. In his pocket lay a crumpled photograph of his sister. June had left for the south a week before the moon. The last message came from the Santa Rosa Enclave. Then the connection died. Ray was determined to make it south at any cost. The line moved slowly. People emerged from the lot with keys in a variety of expressions. Some got a bus, some got a pickup truck, some got an old sedan with bald tires. Standing in front of Ray was Dorian Croft, the son of the owner of a chain of gas stations. Dorian didn't draw lots. He walked off with the coordinator to the container and returned 5 minutes later with the keys to an army SUV with add-on armor. The crowd fell silent. No one wanted to argue with people who still had gas. The coordinator's name was Marcus Vale. He called out Ray's number and looked at the list. Then he looked again. Then he smirked. Ray had been assigned a van at the far end of the lot. An old, all-metal delivery van. Rust had eaten away at the sills and half the fenders. A lightning-shaped crack held the windshield in place. There were 9 liters sloshing around in the tank. Vale said that fate liked to play jokes. He said that Ray wouldn't make it past the first hill in that clunker. The line burst out laughing. Dorian laughed the loudest of all. He shouted that he'd bet a canister that the van wouldn't survive the first night. Ray didn't respond to the laughter. He walked around the van. He crouched down by the wheels. He ran his hand along the frame. Then he walked over to Dorian's SUV and paused for a second by the hood. The engine was idling. Ray listened for 3 seconds. Then he said, in an even voice, that Dorian's armored vehicle had an overloaded front axle. He said the bearing on the right hub was already whining. He said that in 200 kilometers, the hub would seize up while driving. He said the armor had been installed by people who never check the weight. Dorian stopped laughing. Vale opened his mouth and closed it again. The mechanics by the loading ramp exchanged glances. One of them walked over to the SUV and listened closely. Then he slowly straightened up and said nothing. The crowd was already looking at Ray differently. Ray returned to the dispatcher's desk. He was entitled to compensation for the worst vehicle, 10 liters of fuel or a spot in the general convoy. Everyone took the fuel. Ray turned down both options. He asked to be granted access to the old depot and the junkyard by the Eastern Highway. Abandoned vehicles belonged to the city until midnight. After midnight, the city ceased to exist. Vale shrugged and wrote it down. He asked why a living person would need a graveyard of cars. Ray replied that dead cars were more honest than living people. He took the keys and walked toward the van. Dorian called after him that he'd think of him when he drove past his bones. Ray didn't turn around. Inside, the van smelled of dust and old oil. The seat was worn down. The dashboard was faded. Ray inserted the key and placed his palm on the steering column cover. The jagged edge of the rusty metal cut into the pad of his hand. A drop of blood fell onto the dashboard, and the dashboard drank it in. The rust around the drop grew lighter. A thin line of light ran across the dashboard. The light formed into lines. The lines hung right there in the air before his eyes. The collector system welcomed the carrier. The machine's class was designated as the Assembly Corps, Level 1. The traction gauge read 4%. Below, a single instruction glowed. The core is capable of attaching components from any found equipment. Attachment requires contact and the expenditure of thrust. Ray sat motionless for nearly a minute. Then he clenched his cut palm and started the engine. The engine coughed and started, roughly. But it started. Ray drove out of the stadium without looking back. There were 6 hours left until sunset. He didn't head south. He headed east toward the depot. A dead moped lay on its side by the depot gates. Ray stopped next to it. With a dry click, 2 grippers extended from beneath the van's underbody. He hadn't ordered them to. He'd simply thought of it. The grippers pulled the moped up by its frame. The metal creaked. The moped began to sink into the underbody as if into water. 40 seconds later, nothing remained of it. The traction gauge rose to 11%. A new line lit up on the dashboard. Module connected. Battery pack. Onboard power restored. The van's headlights flashed with an even white light. Ray exhaled slowly. He drove into the depot and worked until dusk. The core had devoured 2 rusty trailers and the wreck of a passenger car. The pull had risen to 26%. The van's rear doors were fitted with reinforced hinges. The frames stopped creaking. Ray noticed the cost. Each absorption warmed the floor of the cab. After the third one, his temples throbbed, and the core's casing cooled for 20 minutes. The system couldn't devour things quickly. The sun set. The sky turned crimson. A blood-red moon rose over the dead city, and the roads came to life. The rule was simple. Whoever drives, lives. Ray steered the van onto the ring road and kept to 40 per hour. Similar lights flashed along the shoulders. Hundreds of cars circled around dead Ashford like fish around a reef. On the third lap, he saw a bus on the shoulder. The bus had run out of gas. The people inside were screaming and waving at the passing cars. No one stopped. To stop meant to die with them. From the darkness of the fields, hunters were already streaming toward the bus. Creatures the size of wolves, bodies like bundles of wet ropes. Instead of snouts, they had funnel-shaped mouths full of teeth. They didn't touch a single moving car. They swarmed the bus, and it vanished beneath the writhing mass in a matter of minutes. Ray kept looking in the rearview mirror as long as he could. Then he stopped looking. The knuckles on his hands turned white. He made a vow to himself. His car would never come to a stop. By midnight, he found 2 fresh wrecks on the shoulder, a passenger car, and a pickup truck with a bent axle. Ray slowed down to 5 per hour, and the cord devoured them on the fly. The grippers tore at the metal and pulled it under the undercarriage. Traction reached 40%. The front bumper was encased in a rough steel beam. The tank now held 18 liters. The system was converting part of the absorbed mass into fuel. Ray laughed to himself for the first time in a month, and then his laughter cut short. An army truck was parked by the destroyed bridge over the dry canal, a 6 metric ton truck with a covered cargo bed. It looked intact, too intact. The truck's headlights illuminated the side, and Ray saw long slits in the tarp from the inside out. A faint glow from the radio lit up the truck's cab, and the radio was speaking. A live voice cut through the static, repeating the same numbers over and over. And from beneath the bridge, something large slowly rose into the headlights, much larger than a tracker. Ray Coulter had been assigned a rusty truck and collection rights at the depot after publicly predicting the breakdown of Dorian Croft's armored vehicle. A drop of blood activated the collector system, which allows the van to absorb any vehicle by depleting its traction gauge and overheating its core. By the end of the first night, traction was at 40% and the fuel tank at 18 liters. Near the destroyed bridge, Ray found an army truck with a working radio guarded by a massive creature. The creature stepped fully into the light. It was as tall as a bull. Its body was made of the same wet cables as the hunters, but 3 times thicker. It had bony plates on its back. Ray would later learn that creatures like this were called shepherds. The shepherd turned its muzzle toward the van and froze. The van was moving. Slowly, but it was moving. Ray kept up a speed of 5 per hour and didn't take his eyes off the creature. The rule worked. The shepherd didn't attack moving targets. It stood between the van and the truck and waited. Ray began steering the van in a wide arc around the bridge, lap after lap. He was thinking. The radio in the truck kept repeating numbers. Ray made out them on the third lap. They were coordinates and a frequency, a military beacon. Someone had left the truck as a hideout and never returned. The shepherd wasn't guarding the truck. He'd made his nest under the bridge, and the truck was simply parked on his turf. Ray glanced at the traction gauge, 40%. He looked at the steel beam of the bumper, then at the pile of broken bricks by the exit. The plan came together in 3 parts. He accelerated the van in an arc, and as he rounded the turn, the grapples ripped through the pile of road debris on the fly. The core spat out a trail of rusty shavings and debris beneath the rear wheels. The wind carried the dust toward the nest. The shepherd roared and lunged at the cloud. The creature struck as it moved. The cloud was moving. At that moment, Ray was already steering the van in a straight line toward the truck. The grapples clamped onto the frame of the 6-metric-ton truck. The core howled. It had never lifted such a mass before. The floor of the cab grew scorching hot. Ray's temples throbbed so hard that his vision went dark. The truck was being pulled into the trailer piece by piece, the axles, the frame, the body, the engine. The shepherd tore through a cloud of dust, realized he'd been tricked, and turned around. Ray floored the gas. The van lurched forward, heavier than before, but faster than before. All that remained behind was the truck's cab with the radio. Ray didn't touch it. He might need the beacon later. The shepherd chased him for 2 kilometers and fell behind at the turn. The creatures didn't stray far from their nests. Ray held his breath and looked at the system's display. Heavy node connected. Cargo platform. Node attached. Diesel power unit. Living quarters module open. The van was transforming right before his eyes. The rear section elongated and expanded outward. Inside, a 3x2 meter compartment had materialized. A sleeping berth. Cargo tie-downs. Woven steel walls. The thrust gauge dropped to 9%, and the core cooled down for nearly an hour. Ray jotted down the first rule in his notebook. A large mass provides a big thrust boost, but renders it helpless during the cooling period. You have to eat either in a safe place or on the move, in small portions. He greeted dawn in the living compartment, on a real shelf. The hunters went underground at sunrise. The day belonged to the people. Ray drove east toward the dump from his collection point and saw a trade caravan along the way. 3 trucks with trailers were parked in a circle at the daytime parking lot. An orange rag flag flew above the circle. The merchant's name was Gold, a gray-haired man with a face of wrinkles and numbers. He eyed the rusty van with the strange protrusion of a living quarters and asked what kind of scrap metal he'd come to buy here. Ray said he was buying diesel and information and would pay with scrap metal. Gold laughed and said there was a whole dead world of scrap metal all around. He said that beyond the moon, scrap metal was cheaper than dirt. Ray silently drove the van up to a pile of scrap metal by the parking area, a pile the caravan had been hauling as ballast to meet weight limits on bridges. Clamps crawled out from under the undercarriage and, right before Golt's eyes, devoured 300 kilograms of scrap in a minute. The pull gauge swung upward. From a technological chute on board, the van disgorged smooth ingots of refined steel and 2 cast brackets for the spare tire, exactly like the ones on Golt's trucks, only new. Golt slowly took off his hat. His men dropped their food and came over to watch. The caravan's chief mechanic picked up a bracket, turned it over in his hands, and said quietly that they hadn't even made castings like these before the moon. Golt was already looking at Ray with different eyes, the gaze of a merchant who'd struck gold. They quickly came to an agreement. Ray received 80 liters of diesel fuel, canned goods, and most importantly, a map. Golt marked 3 locations on it. A fallen construction crane near Gates Bridge, a collection agency armored truck stuck in the shallows by the same bridge, and he circled the area he told them to avoid. He said a man named Kessler was operating there. He said Kessler used to own quarries all the way to the moon, but now he collects vehicles and people. people in the place of machines. He said that Kessler's collectors strip everything of value from the roads and leave those who refuse to cooperate standing there until sunset. Ray asked why Galt was being so generous with the stranger. Galt replied that generosity had nothing to do with it. He said he wanted to be the first trader to befriend a machine that devours other machines. As he said goodbye, he looked at the mark left by the devouring. A whitish patch of corroded metal and the distinctive pattern of the claws remained on the asphalt. Galt's expression darkened, and he said that such a mark had to be hidden. He said that Kessler's collectors read the roads like a book. Ray took note. By evening, he reached the junkyard and ate in small portions until sunset. Car wrecks, a mountain of tires, half a bus, traction, 61%. The van's sides had thickened. A second fuel tank had appeared. The system opened a choice menu, and Ray saw the price of advancement for the first time. A water filter module or an observation tower module. He didn't have enough traction to take both. He chose the filter. Water was killing more people now than the beasts. Night fell with a surprise. Ray was driving the van along the eastern highway when he noticed lights in his mirrors. 4 motorcycles had been following him at a distance for half an hour. They weren't getting closer or falling behind. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the motorcycles suddenly sped up. Men in gray with pipes on their backs, a white gear symbol on their fuel tanks, Kessler's emblem. They sped past the van, and one of them fired a harpoon with a cable and a beacon into the side. The van jerked. Ray didn't try to break the cable. He opened the grapples right on the side of the van. The core pulled in the harpoon, the cable, and at the same time, the rear wheel of the nearest motorcycle. The motorcycle came apart at 70 per hour. The rider skidded across the asphalt and screamed. The other 3 darted into the darkness of the fields, and the darkness swallowed them up. No sooner had they stopped to help the fallen rider than the hunters arrived, drawn by the screams. Ray didn't look in the mirrors. He was watching the system display. Node connected, tracking transmitter, active frequency detected. Someone already knew about the van that eats cars, and that someone now knew that Ray knew. Ray tricked the shepherd, devoured an army truck, and gained a living quarters, as well as discovered the rule about the core taking a long time to cool down after a major catch. The merchant Galt went from being a skeptic to an ally. He gave Ray Diesel fuel and a map showing a crane and an armored vehicle near Gates Bridge, and warned him about Kessler, who is gathering vehicles and people. That night, Kessler's scouts marked the van with a harpoon, but Ray absorbed the beacon along with the motorcycle. And now, Kessler knows about the vehicle that devours other vehicles. It was 140 kilometers to Gates Bridge. Ray drove in daily legs and counted the tracks of others. The road to thee was crisscrossed with ruts from heavy convoys. Dozens of vehicles had passed through here, all heading in the same direction. At the turnoff to the river, he realized why. The Gates Bridge had collapsed in the middle, into the water, back in the first week of the moon. The detour ran across a sandbar, and now a caravan was dying on that sandbar. Ray recognized the vehicles from Ashford Stadium. It was the city's joint convoy, 24 vehicles, led by a familiar armored SUV. Dorian Croft had led the group across the sandbar and driven the convoy into the wet sand. 3 vehicles were stuck up to their axles. The rest had clustered around them instead of keeping moving. The daylight had saved them from the hunters, but the day was ending, and lying on its side on the sandbar was the armored cash-in-transit van from Galt's map, as thick as a safe. It was this very vehicle that Dorian's SUV had become entangled with as it tried to pull the stuck vehicles free. People were digging through the sand with their bare hands. A woman with gray hair and a short cut was organizing them into a chain and making them work instead of yelling. Ray recognized her by her highway patrol patch. Captain Irma Solvega. She used to drive long-haul truck convoys all the way to the moon. At the stadium, she was the only one who didn't laugh at his van. Ray pulled up on solid ground and got out. Dorian saw him, and his face broke out in a flushed rash. He shouted that the rusty old tub had come to gawk at someone else's misfortune. He shouted that help from a beggar was an insult. Irma told him to shut up. She asked Ray if he had a winch. Ray said he had something better and asked everyone to step back from the armored vehicle. He got back behind the wheel. The van drove into the water up to its wheel hubs. The grappling hooks latched onto the cash-in-transit hull. The cannon roared loud enough to be heard all along the shore. The armored vehicle was being pulled into the van slowly. First the armor plates, then the axles, then the safe compartment. The people on the shallow stood holding their breath. Irma came closer than anyone else. She watched as the multi-metric ton safe on wheels dissolved into the rusty van, and her expression changed. Disbelief, then calculation, then something resembling hope. The system spouted lines, one after another. Node connected, composite hull armor, node connected, armored glass, protected cockpit module open. The trailer grew. The sides were clad in gray panels. The crack on the windshield vanished beneath a layer of thick glass. Thrust dropped to 15, and the core began to cool down. Ray brought the van to a stop on solid ground, and only then realized he'd made a mistake. He was helpless again for an hour, in full view of 20 cars and 50 strangers. Dorian realized it too. He whispered something to his two men, and they moved toward the van with tire irons. Then something happened that Ray hadn't expected. Irma blocked their path. Behind her stood the men who had been digging up the sand. Irma told Dorian that a man capable of devouring an armored vehicle could devour an SUV as well. She said she'd personally show him exactly who to point the finger at if even a single bolt went missing from the van. Dorian backed down. While the projectile was cooling off, Ray settled the bill. From the service bay, the van unloaded 4 steel ramps and a winch block cast from the armored vehicle's metal. A chain of people pulled the stuck vehicles out in 40 minutes. Irma came to him before sunset. She said bluntly that the convoy wouldn't make it to the south. They had enough fuel for a third of the way. Dorian was leading the people to a place where, according to rumors, there was fuel, to the area marked with a cross in Kessler's territory. Ray spread out Gelt's map and told them what he knew. Irma listened in silence. Then she asked why he wasn't heading to Kessler himself, since that's where most of the vehicles were, and his van devoured vehicles. Ray replied that a wolf doesn't walk into a zoo cage, even if there's plenty of meat there. Irma smiled for the first time. That night, the convoy and the van traveled in formation. Ray taught them to drive in a carousel pattern at low speed to conserve fuel. In the morning, their paths diverged. Irma led part of the convoy along the southern shore. Dorian and the rest turned toward Kessler's territory anyway, chasing the mirage of free fuel. Ray, there was just one passenger left, a girl of about 19 with a mechanic's calloused hands. Her name was Tess. She'd spent 3 years assembling racing engines in her father's workshop until the first night of the moon devoured the workshop. Tess said she wanted to see how the core worked. She said that a machine that digests steel into castings violates 6 laws of thermodynamics, and she wanted to know which others it broke. Ray took her on without further ado. An extra pair of smart hands was worth any cargo. Tess proved her worth on the very first day. She took apart a Kessler tracking transmitter, which the core had spat out as inedible, that had been discarded in a tray, and built a listening device out of it. Now the van could hear the assembler's communications from 30 kilometers away. The first thing they heard made them both fall silent. The dispatcher's dry voice repeated the coordinates. All units were to search for a lone devourer van. Kessler had announced a reward for the entire vehicle, driver, and all. 1 metric ton of fuel. A separate bounty for the driver's head, half a metric ton. Tess asked why the reward was less for a dead man. Ray replied that Kessler was smart. A dead driver couldn't explain how the core worked. That meant they wanted him alive, and that was worse. By evening, they reached the fallen crane. The 50 metric ton boom lay across the interchange like a dinosaur's spine. The crane's cab was covered in white growths. Tess looked through her binoculars and cursed under her breath. In the shadows beneath the boom, a clutch of eggs the size of barrels was swarming, and between the van and the crane, on the road surface, a gear and an arrow had been painted in fresh whitewash. The collectors had found the crane first, and they'd left a mark for their own people. Their convoy could arrive for the crane at any moment. Ray had rescued Ashford's stranded convoy, absorbed the armored cash-in-transit vehicle, and equipped it with composite armor and a protected cabin, while Captain Irma, once a skeptic, had become an ally and provided cover for him while the Corps cooled down. Mechanic Tess went with Ray. She assembled a receiver from the collector's transmitter, and they learned that Kessler had allocated a metric ton of fuel for the van and wanted to capture the driver alive. A 50 metric ton crane was found at the interchange, but beneath its boom lay a nest of the creature's eggs, and the collectors had already marked the crane as their own. Ray didn't wait for the other convoy. He decided to take the crane before dawn the next day and drew up a 3-part plan. Tess called the plan Madness. Then she pulled out her tools and started helping. Part 1 was the decoy. The Corps cast a lattice frame on trailer wheels from their stock of material. Tess mounted a diesel engine from an army truck and a tin cover onto the frame. The result was a rattling contraption, an unmanned machine that drove in circles at low speed and clattered as if it were alive. Part 2 was a matter of timing. The guards would wake up at dusk. That meant they needed the crane during the day and had to run the rattle trap in case the guards on the structure came out early. Part 3 was the hardest. The Corps couldn't handle the 50 metric ton crane in one go. After the armored car incident, Ray knew the price of greed. Tess suggested feeding the Corps on a schedule. She sat down with a stopwatch and a notepad and turned the absorption process into an assembly line. The work took the whole day and was etched into Ray's memory as 4 distinct scenes. Scene 1, noon. The grippers pry open the crane boom like a can of food, while Tess shouts out the Corps' temperature based on the stopwatch, and Ray shuts off the grippers a split second before it hits the red zone. Second, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. From the shadow beneath the boom, a masonry guard the size of a passenger car crawls into the light, and the rattle trap hauls it off to the far circle of the interchange, just as a dog leads a bear away from children. Third, 5 o'clock. The Corps seizes the crane's winch motor, and the van speaks for the first time. The system reads out the lines in a synthetic voice through a new speaker, and Tess drops her stopwatch in surprise. Fourth, sunset. The last section of the boom retracts beneath the chassis, and to the west, on the crest of a hill, 2 gray pickup trucks are parked, watching. They aren't approaching, they're just watching. The collectors were late to the crane and were now writing their report.
Ray watched them through the bulletproof glass and realized the score was open.
Meanwhile, the system had been reconfiguring the vehicle all night. The van was no longer a van. By morning, a 12-meter-long vehicle on 3 axles stood on the road. Its sides were made of composite armor. On top was an observation turret, and on either side of the hull lay 2 mechanical arms made from sections of a crane, boom folded like the legs of a praying mantis. Each arm could lift 3 metric tons. The Corps named the new form Bastion. After all the reconfigurations, the traction remained at 40%, and the system opened a new branch. The message stated that industrial-grade components were needed to switch to the second circuit, a locomotive, a marine diesel engine, and a factory press. Ray read the list aloud, and Tess whistled. She said that the iron's appetites were growing faster than those of humans. The test of the arms came of its own accord. On the 3rd day of the journey, the receiver picked up nearby communications. A squad of 6 assembly vehicles had received their coordinates from those very same observers on the hill and was heading out to intercept them. The squad commander reported to the dispatcher that he was trapping the Devourer with nets on a narrow stretch near the grain elevator. Ray could have headed out into the fields. Instead, he drove to the elevator first. He remembered Galt's words. The harvesters read the roads, so he needed to write the right message for them on the road. There was only one narrow stretch, the dam between 2 dry ponds. Ray positioned the bastion in the middle of the dam with its side across the road and cut the engine. From the outside, the vehicle looked like it had come to a standstill, broken, helpless, a better decoy than any rattling contraption. The squad arrived an hour later, 6 vehicles, 2 with 7 meters. They charged onto the dam from both sides, pinning their prey as they'd been taught, and the dam came to life. The mechanical arms deployed from their ready position in 4 seconds. The first arm lifted the lead pickup truck off the embankment and placed it wheel up in a dry pond. The second caught the cast net in midair, coiled it into a ball, and flung it back, covering the net-launching vehicle with its own gear. The bastion and moved forward straight through the formation. It didn't run over people. Ray struck the vehicles. Grippers on the move tore off wheels and silenced the engines. 3 minutes later, not a single vehicle capable of driving remained on the dam, and the 6 crews of collectors stood on the shoulder looking up at the sky where the sun was already setting. The squad leader, a young guy with a scar across his eyebrow, threw his weapon onto the asphalt and asked what the Devourer would do to them. Ray turned on the speaker and said that the Devourer would spend the night with them if they stayed put. Then the Bastion's arms unloaded a single intact pickup truck and a canister from the bridge deck. That was enough for the 6 of them to make it back to their own lines. The Devourer devoured the remaining 5 vehicles right before their eyes, slowly, demonstratively. The commander watched this and spoke into his radio in a quiet, even voice. Tess translated from the headset. He was telling the dispatcher that it was impossible for a squad to take down the Devourer, that a heavy assault team was needed. Ray thought that was the new problem. He was wrong. The real problem caught up with them a day later. The headset began picking up more than just the gatherers. On the military frequency of that very beacon from the first night, surviving signalmen from the south began speaking. They were broadcasting a report for anyone who could hear it. The horde from the southern coast had set out and was heading north. Not thousands, hundreds of thousands. At the head of the horde was the queen. And the queen wasn't leading the horde by the scent of humans. She was leading the horde by the heat of large machines. Tess slowly turned toward the control panel, where the core's gauge glowed steadily. It was the hottest and largest mechanism within 300 kilometers. The report ended with the coordinates of the horde's axis of movement. Ray plotted them on the map, and his hand froze. The axis ran right through Santa Rosa, through the enclave where June was waiting, and then it ended right at their square. Over the course of a day of conveyor belt-style consumption, Ray and Tess had acquired a 50 metric ton crane by tricking the masonry guards with a rattle, and the van had transformed into a 12-meter-long bastion with 2 mechanical arms. The system had demanded industrial-grade components like a locomotive for the Second Circuit. On the dam, Ray routed a squad of 6 collection vehicles, released the crews, and reported to Kessler that only a heavy unit could take down the Devourer. A report came in over the military frequency that a horde of hundreds of thousands of creatures was approaching from the south, led by the Queen toward the heat of the large machines, and that the horde's main column was passing through Ray's sister's enclave, straight toward the bastion. Ray turned the bastion southward immediately. Tess didn't argue. She simply calculated the fuel supply and said that it would take 12 days to reach Santa Rosa, while, according to the reports, the horde was moving at a pedestrian's pace and would be there in 9. A 3-day difference. 3 days, that had to be found somewhere. The answer was found in the system's list. The Second Circuit promised a new propulsion module and increased speed, a locomotive. Tess spread out a pre-war railway map. The Mercer Junction was almost along their route. A 1-day detour for a chance to gain 5. The math decided it for them. The road to Mercer was packed with oncoming traffic. People were fleeing the horde to the north, and the stream carried the fragments of their stories. From a water truck with a punctured tank, they picked up an eyewitness account. An old man with a gray face told them he'd seen the horde from the ridge. He said it wasn't a pack, but a carpet stretching to the horizon. He said that ahead of the carpet came a wave of abandoned vehicles because people were ditching anything that moved slower than 40 per hour. Tess asked about the mother. The old man was silent for a long time. Then he said the mother wasn't visible. All they could see was how the carpet would sometimes turn all at once, as if it were a single body. By evening, on the second day, the radio picked up a familiar voice. Dorian Croft was shouting on the common frequency. His group had reached Kessler's lands, and there really was fuel there. There was a price, too. Kessler took the vehicles and added the people to the work rosters. Dorian had fled at night with 2 pickup trucks, and now the horde had cut off his route to the north. He called out the coordinates and offered money, pre-war money. There was silence on the airwaves, then Dorian stopped offering and simply begged. His voice no longer sounded like it did in the stadium. Tess looked at Ray and said nothing. The coordinates were 30 kilometers off their route. Ray turned off the road. He said he wasn't doing it for Dorian's sake, but for the sake of the 2 trucks, the crew and the people digging sand on the sandbar. He was only half lying to himself. They found Dorian's group at dawn near a burned-out gas station, 2 pickup trucks, 9 people, and empty fuel tanks. Dorian saw the bastion and didn't immediately realize it was that same rusty van. And when he did, he sat down on the bumper and laughed with the terrifying laugh of a man whose pride had run out. Ray opened the side of the living compartment and said he'd take everyone, but by the rules. Rule number 1, his word is the law on board. Rule number 2, everyone works. Rule number 3, the pickup trucks go into the Corps as payment for the ride. Dorian would have signed anything. While the Corps devoured the pickup trucks, Ray looked at this man and waited for a sense of schadenfreude to well up inside him. The schadenfreude didn't come, something else did. 9 people meant 9 pairs of hands. Irma had said the convoy wouldn't make it to the south, but the crew would. Mercer Station greeted them with silence and the grand prize. A shunting locomotive stood on the tracks by the warehouse. 120 metric tons of steel and a diesel engine the size of a room. Tess stroked its side as if it were alive. The absorption took the rest of the day and all night and proceeded like a siege. The Corps took the locomotive in portions according to Tess's schedule, while Dorian's men, under Ray's leadership, fed the grippers with rails from the second tracks. The rail steel fed into the traction system like coal into a furnace. By dawn, the system announced a new status update in a solemn, synthetic voice. Second circuit open. Industrial class node connected. Power plant undercarriage reconfiguration available. Workshop compartment module available. The Bastion reconfigured itself for 6 hours and emerged from this slumber a different creature. 16 meters, 4 axles with wheels as tall as a man. The locomotive's diesel engine hummed steadily and menacingly beneath the floor. The workshop compartment with workbenches took up the rear, and Tess moved there with all her tools. A second turret rose up on the roof. The maximum highway speed rose to 90. Ray set a direct course for Santa Rosa, and they raced against a carpet of creatures. On the 3rd night of the race, the horde caught up with them, not the whole horde, just the vanguard, an advance force of several thousand that the Queen had cast out toward the heat of the diesel engine. Just as a fisherman casts a net, the radio gave them a half-hour head start. Ray accepted the fight on a straight stretch of the old highway because you can't run away from a net. You have to tear the net apart. The Bastion plowed through the night at 50 per hour, and the hunters poured toward it from the fields like 2 black rivers. What followed wasn't a battle, it was work. The Bastion's arms struck the flanks like chains, raking the creatures off the sides. Dorian, with 2 guys from the turrets, was burning whatever climbed onto the roof. In the workshop, Tess shifted power between her arms and the vehicle's movement in response to Ray's shouts from the cab. Once, her right arm snatched up a discarded fuel tank with a remnant of fuel from the shoulder while the vehicle was moving. The projectile drank it in without stopping and hurled the empty shell into the thick of the creatures. At that moment, Ray caught himself thinking that the machine was fighting the way he'd dreamed of fighting his whole life, calmly, calculated, without retreating a single meter from its course. By 4 in the morning, the horde's momentum had dried up. The creatures retreated into the fields just as suddenly as they had surged forward. The single unified mass withdrew. The Bastion wasn't brought to a stop until dawn. Its armor was covered in deep ruts. Its left arm was bent. Of Dorian's 9 men, 2 were wounded and none were killed. The men slid down from the sides of the ship and laughed for no reason, the way survivors do. Dorian walked over to Ray and silently held out his hand. Ray silently shook it. Neither of them had any words, nor did they need any. And then the laughter on board died down. Tess called everyone to the intercom. A general assembly was underway on Kessler's frequency. The dispatcher read out the order to all units, and the order didn't contain a single word about a reward for the devourer. The order stated that the master was leading Moloch out onto the main road, that all squadrons were to converge on him for the march south. Tess asked over the radio to the familiar voice of the captive, with a scar across his eyebrow, what Moloch was. The commander of the destroyed squadron replied with a single long sentence. For 3 years before the moon, Kessler had built a quarry, and for 2 months after the moon, he'd been teaching it to walk along the highway, and now this mountain of iron, as tall as a 9-story building, was heading south toward the horde because Kessler had decided to claim for himself the largest herd of beasts and the greatest trophy on the road. Ray stepped out of the cab, onto the armor. To the north, beyond the ridge of hills in the morning mist, something was moving, slowly, above the forest. And to the south, where the highway led to Santa Rosa, the entire width of the horizon was already veiled in a living gray ripple. Ray turned toward his sister in Santa Rosa, picked up the battered Dorian and his 9 men, taking their pickup trucks as payment, and at Mercer Station, he overtook a shunting locomotive, activating the second circuit with the workshop compartment, the second turret, and a top speed of 90. In the night race, the Bastion repelled the vanguard of a horde numbering several thousand creatures, and Dorian's crew fought for Ray for the first time without losing a single man. A radio report announced that Kessler was deploying Moloch, a walking machine as tall as a 9-story building, and was heading south after the horde, while ahead on course the horde itself was already visible on the horizon, blocking the path to June. The gray swath to the south grew with every hour of travel. Ray gathered his crew in the workshop compartment and spread a map out on the workbench. 400 kilometers remained to Santa Rosa. The horde was advancing between them and the enclave across a broad front 40 kilometers wide. Circling around the edge of the front would mean losing 4 days. Reports indicated that the enclave's walls would hold out for 2 days after the carpet approached. Once again, the math left no choice. They had to go through it. Dorian said that no one gets through a carpet of creatures. Tess replied that no one had ever had a vehicle with a locomotive-grade diesel engine before. Ray was silent, staring at the map. He wasn't looking for a road, he was looking for a river. The Stillwater River's channel cut across the horde's front. The river had run dry even before the moon, and according to the reports from the old man with the gray face, the creatures didn't like water, not even shallow water. The wet cables of their bodies would swell and lose speed. The riverbed was a road 100 meters wide with water up to the knees. Ray pointed to the map and said they would follow the river. Tess calculated the axle load and said the Bastion could make it across the wet gravel if they slowed down to 30. Dorian asked what would happen if the moth turned the carpet toward the river. Ray replied that then they'd find out how many creatures could fit in the riverbed. Preparations took a day. The Corps devoured a roadside water tower and extended the diesel engine's air intakes above the roof. Tess and Dorian's crew sheathed the lower edges of the hulls with sheets from the tanker to keep water from splashing onto the engines. The wounded were laid in the living quarters away from the sides of the vessel. In the final hour before departure, Ray sat alone in the cab holding a photograph of Juna. Then he tucked it into his breast pocket and started the diesel engine. They entered the riverbed at dawn, so they would have the entire daylight hours ahead of them. For the first 40 kilometers, the river was empty and eerie in its emptiness. Abandoned camps lined the banks, tents without people, campfire pits with cooking pots. Once, they passed a ferry frozen into the shallows, and seagulls watched them from the ferry. No one else. At the 50-kilometer mark, the horde reached the river. At first, the banks simply grew darker. Ray watched through the armored glass as the ridges of both banks became covered with a writhing mass, and the mass flowed along the riverbed level with the Bastion without descending to the water. Thousands of gaping maws were turned toward the vehicle. The creatures marched alongside them kilometer after kilometer without attacking. The water held them, as glass holds a fly. Dorian, in the turret, aimed at first, then stopped. Shooting was like shooting at the surf. By noon, the worst began. Ahead, the riverbed narrowed beneath the supports of a destroyed bridge, and the creatures figured it out. They began to jump, not into the water, but from the supports onto the roof. The first hunter crashed onto the armor in front of the windshield, and Ray saw the funnel-shaped maw a meter from his face. The turret's machine gun blew the creature overboard. Others followed the first. The Bastion drove under the bridge through a falling rain of bodies. The vehicle's arms worked over the roof like windshield wipers, sweeping the creatures away before they could find the seams in the armor. One creature, however, tore open the air intake grill and crawled inside toward the hot diesel engine. Tess met it in the service corridor with a plasma cutter from the workshop. Afterward, she remained silent for an hour, scrubbing her hands with a rag even though they were clean. Beyond the bridge, the riverbed widened, and the downpour of bodies ceased. And 10 kilometers further on, the horde along the banks came to an end. It hadn't fallen behind. It had simply parted. Both banks emptied at once before their eyes, as if on command. Tess said she liked this even less than the creatures. Ray didn't like it either. A single body doesn't let go of its prey. A single body clears the way only when something of its own awaits ahead. The answer lay just around the bend in the riverbed. Across the river, from bank to bank, a dam of vehicles had been piled up. Hundreds of cars, trucks, and buses were compressed into a wall as tall as a 3-story building. It was that very wave of abandoned vehicles that the horde had been driving before it. The womb had gathered them here and dammed up the river. A deep lake had spread out in front of the dam. Behind the dam, on the dry riverbed, a dense mass of creatures waited. The trap had been engineered specifically for the only vehicle in the world capable of traveling on water. Dorian said they needed to turn. Ray looked at the dam and smiled slowly. He said that the mother was intelligent but thought like a beast. A beast builds a barrier from what its prey cannot pass through, and the Bastion gazed upon the largest feeding trough of its life. The core drew right up to the wall of vehicles, and Ray opened the grippers to full capacity. Arms tore at the dam from above. Grippers from below. The thrust surged upward so quickly that Tess kept shouting out the readings nonstop. 5% mass, 10. The core spat out the excess directly into the lake and gnawed through the core of the embankment, gnawing a tunnel. The creatures behind the dam sensed something was wrong and began climbing the embankment from their side. And then Ray did what Tess later called terrifying. He didn't gnaw all the way through the dam. He left a thin wall, gained momentum, and smashed through it with the hull. The dammed-up lake surged through the breach, along with the Bastion. A wall of water twice as tall as a man rolled down the dry riverbed and swept the leading mass of creatures downstream like debris from a drain. The Bastion rode the crest of the flood down the river of wet, floundering bodies. The crew screamed with horror and delight at the same time. By sunset, they had exited the riverbed onto the south bank beyond the horde's front lines. Behind them, stretching to the horizon, lay a gray carpet that could no longer catch up to them. The cannon's thrust stood at 91%. The machine had never been so well fed. The system spent the entire night processing the dam and, by morning, produced a line that Ray couldn't take his eyes off for a long time. Excess mass has been accumulated. Autonomous production module available. The core was proposing to build not only itself, it was proposing to build machines. Small ones, separate ones, its own. Tess read the specifications and said quietly that this was no longer a machine, it was a factory. And Dorian shouted from the turret that smoke was visible to the south. A lot of smoke. The plumes were rising exactly where Santa Rosa was marked on the map. The Enclave was 110 kilometers away, and the smoke could mean anything. Defensive strongholds or funeral pyres. The Bastion made its way through the horde's front lines along the shallow bed of the Stillwater River, surviving a barrage of creatures leaping from the bridge, and Tess killed a hunter that had managed to get inside. Matka dammed the river with a barrier of hundreds of abandoned vehicles, but Ray fed the dam to a projectile, blew it open, and washed away a mass of creatures in a flood and the thrust reached 91%, causing the system to activate the autonomous production module, which allowed them to build individual vehicles. Ahead, 110 kilometers away, Santa Rosa was ablaze where Juna was waiting. The convoy covered the 110 kilometers in an hour and a half, squeezing every last drop of power out of the diesel engine. Ray didn't leave the wheel and didn't speak. The crew understood and didn't interfere. Santa Rosa came into view from the ridge, and Ray stopped the vehicle at the crest. The enclave was alive. The smoke wasn't coming from campfires. Trenches filled with fuel oil were burning along the outer perimeter. Santa Rosa had been a port city, and the survivors had fenced off the peninsula with a triple wall of shipping containers. People were moving about outside the walls. Crews were stationed on the walls. The Enclave was preparing for an onslaught and was burning the trenches in advance to scorch the approaches. But there was a problem. A 3-kilometer strip was crisscrossed with fresh tank tracks, and checkpoints stood along it. Gray vehicles, the gear symbol. Kessler's men had reached Santa Rosa first and encircled the Enclave from the outside. Tess picked up the communications within a minute. The harvesters weren't storming the walls. They were waiting. The dispatcher called it harvesting. Kessler's plan was simple and dirty. The horde would come and crash against the walls. The Enclave would be worn down and die. Moloch would finish off the remnants of the horde, take the queen, and the lynx would gather all the metal from the dead city and all the survivors into worksheets. Kessler wasn't fighting anyone. Kessler was waiting for all his enemies to kill each other. Ray listened, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. Juna was outside the walls. If she was still alive, he picked up the headset microphone and went live on the Enclave's frequency in plain text. He identified himself. He said there was a friend outside with a heavy vehicle. He asked about Juna Coulter from the refugee lists. There was a long silence on the air. Then a woman's voice, an old communications operator, replied that the lists were closed to outside inquiries because vultures had been lurking outside for 2 days now, sniffing around. Ray gripped the microphone, and then a third voice cut in. Young, angry, and painfully familiar. June worked at the Enclave's communications hub and had heard her brother. She said 3 things: that she was alive, that she didn't believe he'd made it this far, and that if he tried to sneak past the vulture's checkpoints now, she'd kill him herself. Ray laughed into the microphone for the first time in many days. The crew in the cockpit cheered and pounded on the armor. The collectors cut the joyful broadcast. 10 minutes later, the Enclave's frequency was jammed, and 3 gray vehicles bearing a white flag of truce headed toward the ridge near the checkpoints. The negotiator's name was Silas Moore. Kessler's right-hand man, a lean man in a clean jumpsuit in the midst of a dirty world. He stepped out of the vehicle unarmed, stood before the bastion, and spoke politely, like a notary. He said that the boss was impressed by the devourer and was withdrawing the bounty on his head, that the boss was offering a contract. The Bastion joins Kessler's fleet, receiving fuel, spare parts, and Moloch's protection, while Ray becomes the chief engineer of the entire fleet. He said the owner had asked him to convey this personally. A single car is just a beast on the road, but a pack of cars is already a civilization. And he asked if Ray really didn't want to build a civilization. Ray replied with a question of his own. He asked whether Kessler's civilization included worksheets. Silas spread his arms and said that order requires accountability. Ray said he'd heard enough. He said he had a counteroffer. Kessler would withdraw the outposts from Santa Rosa by sunset, and then the Bastion wouldn't do to Moloch what it had done to the dam at Stillwater. Silas smiled for the first time. It was a sinister smile. He said the boss had anticipated this response and asked to show him one thing. He pulled out a tablet with a photograph. The photo showed Kessler's quarry with rows of machines lined up inside it, dozens of heavy machines, and walking among them were people in gray robes with numbers on their backs. Silas zoomed in on one number. A name was written beneath it, Irma Solveig. Irma's southern column never made it south. They'd captured her on Kessler's lands 2 weeks ago. Silas said the captain was alive and well and working as a dispatcher at the quarry, for now at least. He said the boss was counting on all sides to act sensibly. He bowed and drove off. Silence filled the cab. Dorian was the first to speak, his voice trembling with anger. He said he knew the quarry. His group had been held there for a week. He'd seen the guard posts and the shift rotations. Ray remained silent, gazing south toward the smoke where his sister lived and north toward where Moloch was coming from. Then he gathered the crew and laid everything out honestly. The horde would reach Santa Rosa in 2 days. At its current speed, Moloch would arrive in 3. Irma was in the quarry, 400 kilometers away. A single vehicle couldn't save everyone at once. Tess said one couldn't. And she laid the production module specifications on the workbench. The core, operating at 90% thrust, could build 3 small autonomous vehicles: a scout, a courier, and a remote-controlled hauler. Tess suggested splitting up the vehicle, not the people. They put the plan together overnight, and it was outrageously bold. The Bastion remains at Santa Rosa and will face the horde alongside the Enclave because the walls won't hold without a heavy vehicle. And a courier is heading to the quarry beyond Irma, a small, fast vehicle with 2 people. Dorian said he'd lead the courier because he knows the quarry inside out. Everyone looked at him. The man who had laughed at the rusty van at the stadium was volunteering to go into the thick of the action after the woman who had once stood in the way of his wrenches. Ray asked if he was sure. Dorian replied that he'd spent his whole life paying with others. He wanted to pay with himself just this once. The Corps built vehicles all the next day. A courier that looked like an armored wasp drove out of the workshop bay's gates, 200 kilometers per hour on the highway. Following it was a scout the size of a motorcycle. Ray kept the tractor inside the facility to conserve traction. That evening, Juna broke through the jammer, using Morse code reflected off a wall-mounted searchlight. Tess read the flashes aloud. The Enclave had made its decision. The Santa Rosa Council was opening the northern gates of the Bastion. The city is letting in the vehicle that the river of monsters couldn't destroy. Ray watched the searchlight flashes, unaware that the sentries at the checkpoints were reading them too. And that Silas Moore had already sent Kessler a report with a single conclusion. The Devourer had taken root, and the one that had taken root now had a destination. Juna was alive and working as a communications operator in Santa Rosa, which Kessler's men had surrounded to gather the harvest after the Enclave's battle with the Horde. Negotiator Silas Moore offered Ray a contract and revealed that Irma was being held hostage in Kessler's slave camp. The crew decided to split up. The Corps built small vehicles based on the new module, and Dorian volunteered to lead the courier to rescue Irma, while the Enclave opened the Bastion's gates, at which point Kessler learned that Ray now had a vulnerability linked to his address. The courier set out into the night with Dorian and a guy named Felix from his old group. Ray, the scout, was sent north to keep an eye on Moloch. At dawn, the Bastion entered Santa Rosa through the northern gates between the walls of shipping containers. The city greeted it in silence. People stood along the port's main road, staring at the 16-meter-tall armor and the folded arms formed by the crane sections. Children pointed. The adults weighed their chances. Juna was waiting by the second wall, a small girl with her father's stubborn chin and a burn from the radio on her cheek. Ray jumped down from the armor and she punched him in the chest with her fist, then hugged him so tightly his ribs cracked. She whispered into his shoulder that he was an idiot for charging through the horde. Ray replied that idiocy ran in the family. They had 4 minutes for their embrace, then the war took them both. The Enclave Council was meeting in the port office. A woman named Okafor, a former port engineer, was in command of the defense. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She laid out a map of the city and told it like it was. The walls could withstand heavy fire but wouldn't hold out against the herders. According to reports, there were hundreds of herders in the horde, and they were acting like battering rams. The shepherds had breached the previous coastal enclave in a single night. Ray looked at the port map and asked a single question. He asked what was left of the ships in the port. Okafor looked up at him. An unfinished bulk carrier stood in the dry dock. A vessel 140 meters long. No propulsion, no cargo, but with a hull and a main prize. The ship's diesel engine in the engine room, an industrial-grade unit from the secondary supply list. Ray said he needed that diesel engine and all the ship's steel the city was willing to give up. In return, the Corps would rebuild the port's defenses in 2 days. The council debated for an hour. Okafor cut the debate short with a single sentence. She said the city had nothing to pay the machine with except iron, and that the iron of a dead city wouldn't save it. For the next 2 days, Santa Rosa didn't sleep, and neither did Ray. The Corps devoured the bulk carrier like a whale eats plankton, steadily and continuously, while a counterflow emerged from the process chutes and the workshop compartment. Steel spikes for the moat, cast liners for the container walls, spiked plates for the shallow water bottom. Tess assembled 4 projectile launchers for the walls from ship fittings because the city was running out of gunpowder. But there were plenty of stones in the port. Juna coordinated hundreds of hands from the communications center. Over those 2 days, Ray saw his sister in action and realized that she was no longer the youngest. People obeyed her voice as if it were an order. The ship's diesel engine was the last to be brought online the night before the horde arrived. The system chanted the lines Ray had been waiting for. Second industrial grade node connected. Power circuit reconfiguration available. External power supply module available. The Bastion could now feed power outward via cables. Tess and Okafor realized this at the same time and exchanged glances. By dawn, the floodlights along the entire perimeter and the welding stations on the walls were powered by the heart of the machine. The city and the Bastion had fused into a single entity. The horde arrived at noon. First, the horizon trembled. Then came the sound, not a roar, a rustle. A dry rustle of millions of cables across the ground that made the faces of the people on the walls turn pale. The carpet of cables flowed from the ridge down into the harbor valley for 3 hours and still didn't end. A scout on the hills relayed the image, and Tess displayed it on the screen in the office. Okafor watched in silence. Then she said the reports had lied. She said there weren't hundreds of thousands here. There was 1 million. The first wave crashed into the moats filled with burning fuel oil at sunset. The creatures marched into the fire without slowing down and extinguished it with their bodies. Within an hour, the moats had become bridges of charred flesh, and the mass surged toward the walls. After that, time for Ray blurred into one long roar. The Bastion served as the beating heart of the defense. He moved along the inner wall to wherever the cracking came from. His hands tore the creatures off the crest of the wall, mowing them down by the dozens. Tess's catapults fired over the wall in a sweeping arc. Diesel-powered searchlights blinded the gaping maws. The shepherds arrived at night, just as Okafor had said. 20 creatures the size of trucks slammed into the western wall all at once, targeting a single spot. Clever, a grown-up move. The containers rolled into action. The wall bulged, and a mass of them was already crawling through the breach when the Bastion managed to reach it. Ray plugged the breach with the vehicle itself. He wedged 16 meters of armor into the gap in the wall like a seal, and his hands worked in both directions. The creatures swarmed the Bastion in a layer 3 bodies thick. Inside, you could hear thousands of teeth scraping against the composite armor of the armored truck's vault. Tess kept the cooling system running at full capacity. Juna was directing reinforcements from all over the city to the breach over the radio. The people of Santa Rosa fought for the vehicle just as the vehicle fought for them. The cutters burned the creatures on the armor with welding torches. The hookers pulled them off with grappling hooks. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the western breach behind the Bastion had been sealed, restoring the wall, and the vehicle emerged from the swarm, scarred but alive. And at dawn, the creatures poured in. The entire swarm receded from the walls by a kilometer all at once and froze. The city did not rejoice. Everyone who had survived even one night of the moon knew that the creatures do not turn away from food. They were called back. From the horizon, the mass moved like ripples on water, only in reverse. The ripples converged. The mass condensed and rose into a hump, and the hump grew. For the first time, the queen herself was heading out to her prey. A scout on the hill transmitted the last frame before the mass engulfed his position. In the frame, a body resembling a mountain of wet ropes as tall as the enclave's wall rose from the gray carpet, and along the mountain's crest ran bone plates like those worn by shepherds, only each one the size of a gate. And at that very moment, Tess picked up 2 words in plain text from Dorian. On the northern frequency, the first word was Irma, the second word was alive. Then the northern frequency went dead, and in its place, a steady low voice spoke simultaneously across all frequencies, a voice Ray heard for the first time but recognized immediately. Kessler had gone on the air personally. He said he was looking down at the valley from the ridge, that he could see the city, a car, and a herd. He said he had come to take all 3 and would start with the simplest one, and then the earth shook. Beyond the ridge, above the hills, a spire as tall as a 9-story building rose into the dawn sky, and Moloch took his first step down into the valley. Ray reunited with June, entered Santa Rosa, and within 2 days fused with the city, absorbing a bulk carrier with a marine diesel engine, acquiring an external power module, and powering the defenses from the core. The Enclave, with its bastion, repelled the first assault by a 1,000,000-strong horde, including a nighttime breakthrough by the herders, which Ray stopped with the hull. Dorian reported that Irma had been rescued and that they were alive, after which Kessler personally went on the air to announce that he was taking the city, the machine, and the horde, and Moloch began to descend into the valley. Moloch had been descending from the ridge for an hour, and for that entire hour the valley was silent. Even the horde stood still. Kessler's walking machine didn't walk, it strode. 4 supports, the size of a house, carried the platform on which an entire settlement stood: workshops, cranes, residential blocks, fuel tanks. On the upper deck, a wheelhouse with floor-to-ceiling glass jutted out, and Ray knew that the owner was looking down at the valley from there. Around Moloch's legs, teams of assemblers were moving, 50 machines. Okafor asked how much this mountain weighed. Tess calculated based on the support marks and said quietly that it was 12,000 metric tons. The bastion weighed 240. Kessler didn't start with the city. He started with the horde, as he'd promised. Harpoon batteries fired from Moloch's deck, and dozens of cables with anchors spread out like a living carpet. An electric current surged through the cables. A strip of the horde, as wide as a stadium, boiled over and fell motionless, while Moloch's hook cranes began hauling the dead mass onto the deck into processing hoppers. Kessler was devouring the horde. Literally, his machine was converting the creatures into fat and protein for fuel and feed. That was why he needed the largest herd. Moloch was not a weapon. Moloch was a combine harvester. The horde responded as a single organism. The carpet rolled away from the walls of Santa Rosa and flowed toward a new threat. The creatures swarmed the Moloch supports in black streams, and it became clear why the supports were so high. The creatures slid off the smooth sections, and those that managed to reach the deck were mowed down by the turrets. The mother moved toward the Moloch of the shepherds, and the hump of her own body turned in that direction as well. Okafor watched this and said that the 2 monsters were busy with each other, and the city could breathe a sigh of relief. Ray said no, that Kessler was doing exactly what he'd promised. He was pitting the enemies against each other and would take the survivors. They had to make a decision now, while the 2 mountains were still locked in combat, and Ray decided on something no one, including himself, had expected. He called a council meeting and announced that the Bastion was leaving the city. Juno was the first to stand up and asked if he'd lost his mind. Ray laid Tess's calculations out on the table. Moloch would breach the walls overnight because 1,000,000 bodies is 1,000,000 bodies. Then the horde, having gorged itself on the dead, would return to the city and the walls simply hold out. There's no other option. And if Moloch wins, then Kessler will arrive at the city with full bunkers and 50 squads. Both outcomes mean the death of Santa Rosa. The city survives only if both die, and only someone who gets between them can kill both. The plan was based on 3 facts. Fact 1, Motka leads the horde toward the hottest and heaviest metal. Right now, that's Moloch. Fact number 2, Moloch's harpoon current kills the creatures in droves, but the batteries are powered by the main tank on the lower deck, Fact number 3. The Bastion's core can radiate energy outward, which means it can also feign activity. Tess was the first to realize this, and her eyes widened. She said that if they revved up the diesel engines at idle through the external circuit, the Bastion's heat signature could be amplified to exceed that of Malak. A 240 metric ton machine could masquerade as a 12,000 metric ton machine to the Queen. A decoy. Brilliant. The Bastion lures the Queen and the Horde away from Moloch just far enough to burn his main fuel tank and send the Horde back to the de-energized cripple. Moloch without power is simply the biggest feeding trough in history. Okafor was silent for a long time. Then she asked what the city should do. Rei said to hold the walls and pray to any gods. Juna went with the Bastion, and for the first time, Rei couldn't stop her. The mobile communications hub was needed by the vehicle more than by the city. They set out at dusk. The Bastion circled around the Horde along the eastern hills, activated its external heat signature, and turned into a beacon on the world's thermal maps. The effect kicked in 10 minutes later. The hump of the womb in the middle of the carpet stopped. It turned around, and the entire million turned with it. It felt like standing on a beach and seeing the ocean coming right at you. What followed was the longest night. Bastion moved through the hills at 40 per hour, while the carpet flowed behind him through the valley. Rei kept his distance like a tightrope walker. Let it get too far away, and the womb would return to Moloch. Let it get too close, and the Horde's tongues would reach the hull. Twice, the leading thousands came within striking distance, and hands with turrets shook them off on the fly. Tess lived between the workshop and the control panel, keeping the overheated discharge circuit running on trust and electrical tape. Juna picked up the panicked radio traffic from the harvesters. On Moloch, they realized the herd was leaving, and Kessler was turning his behemoth around to follow. Because a harvester without a herd is a mountain of debt. Everything was going according to plan until the plan ran into Silas Moore. Kessler's clever man figured out the decoy within an hour. Juna intercepted his report to the boss. Silas reported that the Devourer was drawing the herd toward itself, meaning it intended to burn Moloch's storage facilities and requested permission to launch an immediate all-out assault on the Bastion. Kessler thought for 30 seconds of radio silence. Then he gave the go-ahead. And 50 vehicles set out from the flanks of the valley to intercept the live bait, which was being pressed from the rear by a million creatures. Rei found himself caught between the hammer of the herd and the anvil. He looked at the map, then at the thrust gauge, then at Tess, and he asked how many small vehicles the Corps could build on the fly if it tapped into the untouchable mass reserve. Tess said 4 tractor units in 2 hours, but that would reduce the side armor's effectiveness by 20%. Rei ordered them to build them. 2 hours later, 4 remotely controlled tractors rolled out of the Bastion's stern gates, each pulling a string of empty tanks with hot exhaust from the core. 4 small flares fanned out across the valley. The Bastion's heat signature spread across 5 targets. The mother slowed down, weighing her options. Silas's units also split up among the targets. This was exactly what Rei had been waiting for. The real Bastion, with its exhaust extinguished, dove into the dead zone behind the hills and, following the bed of a dried-up stream, headed straight for Malak from the direction they least expected. From the north. Out of the darkness.
By 3 o'clock in the morning, Moloch's supports loomed before the windshield like the legs of a god.
Deck lights were burning above, and the cranes continued to swing. Rei maneuvered the Bastion right up against the rear support and rested both of the vehicle's arms on the support's access ladder. Just then, Juna took off her earpiece and said she had 2 pieces of news. First, Dorian and Irma were in direct visual contact. They'd made it to the scene just in time, and Irma was bringing something with her. The second piece of news was worse. Silas Moore hadn't fallen for the flares. His personal convoy of 6 heavy vehicles was following the trail of the actual Bastion along the stream bed. The distance was a 7-minute drive. According to Tess's calculations, the climb to Moloch's support pillar would take 10 minutes. Moloch turned out to be a harvester that processed creatures into fuel, and Kessler began devouring the Horde. So Rei moved the Bastion out of the city to let the 2 giants fight it out to the end. Using an external energy discharge, the Bastion masqueraded as the largest machine in the valley and lured the Queen and her million-strong horde away from Moloch. To prevent interception by 50 links, it scattered its heat signature using 4 tractor trailers equipped with flares. The real Bastion stealthily made its way to Moloch's rear support pillar for a diversion, but Silas saw through the ruse, and his heavy squad would be at the support in 7 minutes, with a 10-minute climb ahead, while Dorian and Irma, who was carrying something with her, appeared nearby. 7 minutes against 10. Ray solved the problem in 10 seconds. He said it wouldn't be the Bastion going up, the arms would go up. The plan changed on the fly. The machine remained below at the support to engage Silas's team while Ray undocked both mechanical arms. The system allowed this via the secondary circuit, but Ray had never tried it before. The arms, equipped with gripping blocks and remote controls, crawled up the support's access ladder like 2 steel mantises, carrying Tess in a cradle with a cutting torch and explosive charges from the workshop. Tess volunteered herself because she was the only one who knew the fuel valves. Ray watched as his machine's sister unit disappeared upward into the darkness, and for the first time in the entire lunar mission, his fingers trembled. Juna took her place at the arm's remote controls. Ray sat down at the controls and turrets. Silas's squad shot out of the creek bed, right on schedule, 6 heavy vehicles, 2 with harpoon batteries like Moloch's, only smaller. No negotiations. Electrified harpoons struck from both sides at once. The Bastion, missing 20% of its armor and both arms, took the first shock across its entire hull. The instrument panel flared up. The screens crumbled. Ray, isolated in his seat, stayed conscious and did the only thing he could. He drove straight at the harpooners, pulling on their own cables. Silas's machines were smart, but the physics were old school. 240 metric tons on a taut cable isn't a prize, it's an anchor. The first harpooner was ripped off its wheels, and the Bastion ran over its spine. The second one severed its own cables, then a dogfight broke out in the darkness beneath the feet of the walking house. 4 more vehicles circled around the half-blinded Bastion, jabbing at the joints in its armor with cutters and wedges. Ray fought with the steering wheel, with the hull, its weight. He rammed one vehicle into Moloch's support pillar. He shook the second one off into the trench. And the third one clung to the stern with a boarding party, and the sound of people's feet tapping against the armor could be heard. And just then, our own men flew into the melee from the flank. Dorian's courier leaped out of the darkness like a wasp and swept the boarders off the stern with a net stretched between the arches, and following the courier out of the night rolled what Irma was driving, a quarry dump truck as tall as a 2-story house, with a bucket welded into a battering ram. Irma had stolen Kessler's own vehicle from the quarry, and her voice over the radio was as calm as the shallows. She said she'd brought the debt. The dump truck swept away the last car in the convoy on the fly. Silas walked off into the darkness, and Ray let him go because the main event was about to begin upstairs. Tess had arrived. The crew dropped her off on the lower deck by the main fuel tank, and June guided their grapple arms according to her commands, clearing the deck turrets out of the way. Tess cut through the rebar, placed charges on the fuel line, and was already walking away when the deck beneath her shook, not from a machine. It was a voice. Kessler had come on the general channel, and his voice was as steady as ever. He said he could see guests on his deck and guests below, that he appreciated the plan for what it was worth, and that the plan had overlooked one thing. Moloch was built in a world where the moon already existed. That's why Moloch has 2 fuel circuits. Blow up the first one, he said. The second will take us home. And then he added words that sent a chill down Ray's spine. Kessler said he thanked the Devourer for bringing the herd back. Ray turned toward the north. The horizon was shifting. The womb had dealt with the tow truck's flares and was leading a millions back to the biggest piece of metal, toward Moloch, and toward everyone standing at its feet. Every minute counted, and Ray bellowed over the airwaves for everyone to head east immediately. Tess fired her charges without waiting for the launch cradle, and Moloch's main tank burst into flames from within, knocking out half the deck lights. Hands caught Tess in midair on the lower deck. Moloch swayed, but held its ground, creaking as it pivoted on its backup circuit. Kessler was steering the behemoth north toward home, just as he'd said, slowly. Too slowly, the first tongues of the horde reached Moloch's supports just as the bastion, with the courier and Irma's dump truck, was already retreating toward the eastern hills. Ray stopped the car on the ridge because he couldn't help but watch. Moloch was fading into the night, firing back with its turrets, while the carpet flowed behind it and over it. The creatures were climbing the supports, drawn by the light of the fire in the tanker. The mountain strode forward, shaking off thousands of bodies, and kept moving, shaking them off. Kessler fought for his mountain with fierce determination and skill. And then, over the mountain's shoulder, in the light of the fire, everyone saw the mother. She emerged from the carpet to her full height and laid her body on Moloch's rear support. The support held. A second wave of bodies. The support bent. Moloch sank onto a corner like a man on a bruised knee, but continued to crawl on 3 supports, dragging the 4th along. Juna said quietly that she never thought she'd feel sorry for Kessler. Irma replied that it wasn't Kessler who deserved pity, but those on his decks in the work crews. Ray remained silent and did the math. Based on the speed of the carpet and the speed of the cripple, it looked like Moloch would make it to the ridge and pull the horde northward behind him, away from Santa Rosa. The city had a few weeks to live. The crew had a night to catch their breath. They formed a circle in an old gravel quarry. The Bastion Courier dump truck and 2 torch tractor trailers, the only 2 of the original 4 to survive, had arrived from the south. For the first time since the start of the moon, 11 people were sitting around the campfire between the vehicles, and they were all their own people. Dorian was telling the story of how he, Felix, and Irma had taken over the quarry, and half the story was about how Irma had commanded Kessler's guards with such confidence that they fell into line. Irma shared the most important news. There were people left in the quarry, hundreds people on Kessler's payroll at the sites, and all of them were now without supervision because the boss had taken everything living to Moloch. And she also said that there was food left in the quarry, excavators, crushers, an industrial press from the Second Circuit's list, an entire iron city without guards. Tess looked up from her mug. Ray glanced at the traction gauge. 47% remaining after all expenditures. The system seemed to sense his gaze and displayed a line he hadn't seen yet. A stationary assembly is required to transition to the Third Circuit. The Corps proposes establishing a base. Ray read this aloud, and silence hung over the campfire. The machine that had been able to do nothing but travel across the entire moon was asking to put down roots. But the moon's rule stated that roots meant death. Juna was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. She asked, "What if the rule isn't complete? Creatures are drawn to stillness and warmth. But a city on wheels is neither a home nor a machine. What if we build a base that moves?" Irma smiled and said that a state needs a territory. Tess replied that territory could exist on axles. Ray stared into the fire and saw the whole picture. A quarry with a press, hundreds of freed hands, tractors pulling workshop platforms on wheels around the bastion, just as cities were built around fortresses, a mobile state that never stands still. He had already opened his mouth to announce the decision, and when Juna raised her hand to her earpiece, her expression changed. She said that on the Southern Military Frequency, the same communications officer from that first night was speaking again, the one with the coordinates. Only now he wasn't repeating the numbers. Now he was calling out a name. The caller addressed the Devourer and said he knew what its core was, where it came from, and why the Queen was leading the Horde specifically toward the large machines. The communications officer said there wasn't just one queen, that a second one was awakening in the south. And that if the Devourer wanted humanity to have even a single chance, it had to reach the ocean before her. The communications officer went by the call sign Lighthouse and was speaking from the fleet's communications bunker on the southern coast. Ray asked him a single verification question. He asked what numbers had been transmitted near the bridge on the first night. Lighthouse listed them without hesitation and added the frequency. It was his truck, his hideout. His voice had been waiting a month for someone to survive. Mayak went on talking for an hour, and the crew listened without interrupting. Before the moon, he'd served in a program called the Ark. The fleet was searching for an answer to the question of what to do if the infrastructure collapsed overnight. The answer was the assembly cores, experimental machines, capable of rebuilding themselves from any scrap metal. 4 of them were built and sent to test sites in unremarkable casings. One core headed north in the bed of an old delivery van and disappeared from the records a week before the moon mission. Ray listened, his hand resting on the control panel. His fate turned out to be not a gift from heaven, but a clerical error. Tess asked the crucial question, how do the creatures know about the big machines? The beacon replied with difficulty. The creatures didn't arrive by chance. The blood moon was not the cause, but a signal. Something deep in the ocean had awakened from the electromagnetic noise of civilization and sent hordes ashore, just as the immune system sends cells to attack a splinter. The queens are drawn to the strongest sources of heat and magnetic fields because, to them, a large machine is a disease. Thus, the assembly cores, with their background radiation, are the brightest splinter on the continent for the queens. Juna said that this meant the Bastion had been a target all along, not a hunter. The beacon replied that it meant something else. It meant that the Bastion was the only decoy that could be controlled. He then explained why he had called. The second queen was waking up in a flooded industrial district of Caldera's southern port. While she sleeps, her cocoon is vulnerable. Before its destruction, the fleet managed to accomplish one thing. In Caldera's dry dock, the unfinished Arc 2 platform remained. A stationary assembly of the Third Circuit. That very node from the system's chain. If Ray's core reaches the dry dock and merges with the platform, it will gain access to the program's archive and to the weapons designed to combat the cocoons. If it doesn't reach it, the second matrix will emerge in a month, raise the southern hordes, and then there won't be enough wheels on the continent to escape. Ray turned off the transmission and looked at his team. The decision wasn't made by a vote, but through discussions that lasted until morning. Irma stood behind the quarry. Hundreds of people on the worksheets couldn't wait. Dorian unexpectedly sided with the South and said he'd learned a simple lesson from Ray. A problem that's growing must be nipped in the bud. Tess was silent, counting. Then she said there was no need to choose. The road to Caldera runs half a day's journey from the quarry. The decision came together on its own. Head south through the quarry. Take the People's Press and all the metal. Build a state on the fly, just as they dreamed by the campfire. The convoy set out at dawn, and for the first time, it was truly a convoy. The Bastion led the way. Irma's dump truck brought up the rear. The courier served as scout. Tractors with flatbeds filled the gaps in between. Kessler's quarry met them with silence and locked gates. There were about 15 guards left, commanded by an elderly technician who, upon seeing the Bastion, simply opened the gates. He said he hadn't come up with the timesheets himself and hadn't signed up to die for someone else's accounting. The liberation felt like just another day, and that made it all the more powerful. People emerged from the barracks, squinting at the column, unable to believe their eyes. Irma walked among them, and they recognized her. By noon, Ray had 400 men, and the question of what to do with them, the answer came from the shell. Taking over the quarry took 2 days and felt like a second birth. Crushers, excavators, conveyors, tankers, narrow-gauge rails. Over 100% of the output went into the reserve fund. The system was now building streets instead of compartments. Residential platforms on axles rolled out of the workshop gates. Water trucks, a kitchen on wheels, a mobile repair unit. People took their places at the workbenches on their own because among the 400, there were lathe operators, welders, drivers, and mechanics. Okafor sent a convoy from Santa Rosa with food supplies and 20 volunteers. By the end of the third day, something that defied a name crawled out of the quarry onto the southern highway. 40 vehicles in a single formation encircling the Bastion. The lead patrol, flanking trucks, the living quarters, the repair quarters. On the air, Juna called it caravan with a capital C, and the word stuck. The caravan strictly adhered to the rule of the moon. It never stopped. They slept on the move. They made repairs on the move. They taught their children on the move. At night, the creatures would come out to the roadside, watch the moving city, and not attack. The people on the platforms slept peacefully for the first time in the entire moon. On the 5th day of the journey, the South reminded them that there are no easy roads. A scout found tracks on the highway, wide ruts as if from dragging, and nearby, support footprints, familiar footprints. Moloch had passed through here, heading south. Kessler hadn't taken the mountain home to the north. He'd even deceived his own people over the airwaves, turned around behind the ridge, and crawled, crippled, toward Caldera. Juna intercepted a snippet of his internal communication, and everything fell into place. Kessler had his own captured fleet communications officer. The master had known about the Ark for a long time. He had been heading for the 3rd Circuit platform from the very beginning, and the horde, with the womb hanging on his trail, was dragging itself there as well. Tess summed up the situation in a single sentence. A dying mountain of iron, a million creatures, a second dormant womb, and a city on wheels were all racing toward the continent's only dock. Ray looked toward the southern horizon, where the gray of the ocean was already faintly visible through the haze, and thought that one participant was missing from Tess's list, the one who had sent the signal to the hordes from the depths. And that participant hadn't made a single move yet. The communications officer, Mayak, revealed that Ray's corps was one of the 4 military corps of the ARC program, and that the creatures were the ocean depths' immune response to the noise of civilization, and that the wombs targeted large machines as if they were a disease. Waiting in the dock at Caldera Port was the Arc 2 platform, providing a 3rd circuit and a weapon against the cocoon of the second womb, which will awaken in a month. Ray liberated Kessler's quarry, swallowed it whole, and built the Caravan, a mobile city of 40 vehicles, housing 400 people, but it turned out that Kessler had tricked the crippled Moloch, with a horde clinging to it, into heading for that very same dock. The Caravan raced south for 7 days, and with each passing day, the journey grew more costly. Moloch moved more slowly, but had a head start and took a direct route through the dead cities, blazing its own path through the streets. The Caravan traveled faster, but had to take detours because 40 vehicles couldn't squeeze through the ruins. According to Tess's calculations, both columns were due to reach Caldera almost simultaneously, and this was the worst-case scenario. On the 3rd day of the race, something happened that Ray later called the greatest battle on the entire moon, even though not a single shot was fired. That evening, Silas Moore came on the long-range radio, alive. He'd left the support structures on foot back then, made it back to his own people, and was now leading the remnants of the squads near Moloch. Silas asked to speak without the boss present. Ray gave him the frequency. Silas spoke quietly and quickly. He said that Moloch was dying. The backup circuit was burning out, the support structure couldn't hold, and Kessler knew it. He said that the boss had relayed an order to the decks that few had heard. If the mountain didn't reach the dock first, Kessler would position it across the entrance to the caldera and block the fairway with its hull so that the platform wouldn't fall into anyone's hands. He said that 150 people from the work crews remained on Moloch's decks, and the boss wouldn't let them go. Let them go because their hands are needed until the very last hour. Then Silas paused and added why he'd actually called him. He asked if the caravan would take the people if they left the mountain on their own. Ray asked what Silas wanted in exchange for 150 lives. Silas replied that he wanted nothing. He said that all his life he'd considered himself a man of order, but order turned out to be an accounting system built on bones. He wants to count the other way, just this once. Ray recognized the words. That's what Dorian had said at the burned-down gas station. The moon reshaped people in terrifying ways, but sometimes in the right direction. They spent 2 days preparing the escape from Moloch at both ends of the broadcast. Tess and June pieced together a plan from scraps, like salvaging from junk. On the night of the 6th day of the race, as Moloch was crossing the river over the industrial bridge, Silas started a fire on the lower deck in the processing bunker. Smoke settled over the river. Under the cover of smoke, people poured from the gangway and ropes down the mountain into the water, where a courier and both tugboats with pontoons made from empty tankers were waiting for them. That night, the convoy approached the mountain 20 kilometers closer than prudence would allow and took on 142 people from the river. Not everyone made it. Silas remained on deck to cover the gangplank and was taken by the owner's men. The last thing he transmitted over the airwaves was his usual calm suggestion to consider his contract fulfilled. Kessler came on the line an hour later. For the first time, his voice was not steady. He wasn't shouting. Worse, he spoke like a man from whom not a possession but a belief had been stolen. He said he had fed these people when the world ended, that he had given them work, purpose, and protection, that the devourer corrupts everything it touches with its rusty charity. And he ended briefly. He said he was withdrawing all his previous offers. We'll meet at the dock like beasts. On the morning of the 7th day, the caravan reached the coastal ridge and the people saw the ocean. For many of the children of the moon, it was their first time seeing it. Gray water stretching to the edge of the world and not a single fire on the water. And below, beneath the ridge, lay the caldera, and at the sight of the harbor, the column fell silent. Half the city stood in water. Flooded neighborhoods of cranes, the rusty hulls of dry cargo ships, and above the southern industrial district hung a glow that was not from fire. A pink radiance emanated from beneath the water, from the flooded workshops, as if a heart were beating slowly there beneath the depths. The cocoon of the second womb was visible 10 kilometers away. The dry dock, with the Arc 2 platform, loomed darkly at the northern edge of the port, intact within reach. The lighthouse guided them from the ridge along the streets, now clear of water, and its voice trembled as the months of waiting drew to a close. And from the east, Moloch was already entering the caldera. The mountain was moving with its last ounce of strength. The support structure dragged behind. The decks were ablaze in 3 places. Behind the mountain, half a day's journey away, a horde was kicking up dust. The mother was driving the herd without stopping, and the carpet stretched 40 kilometers along the coastal highway. The timing had turned into a perfect catastrophe. All participants were arriving at the port within a single day. Ray gathered the commanders on the main platform, Irma, Dorian, Tess, Juna, Okafor via comlink, and Mayak on the screen. He spread out a map of the port and said that he'd been thinking for 7 days and had come up with only one idea. All plans were the caravan fights for the dock against the mountain and the horde end in a graveyard, so we need a plan where everyone else fights for the dock. Moloch is heading out to flood the fairway. The horde is following Moloch. The cocoon is sleeping underwater, and the queen leads the herd past it without sensing it, because the sleeping cocoon is cold. Ray's plan hinged on a single brutal idea: to wake the cocoon before its time, right under Moloch's feet. Tess was the first to grasp the scale of it and quietly cursed. He asked what would happen if the second queen woke up and they didn't manage to retrieve the weapons from the platform in time. Ray replied that then they'd die in good company. The math didn't allow for any other options. Juna asked how they'd wake the cocoon. The beacon on the screen replied that it would be the same way they'd summoned the creatures from the depths, with noise, with a field with field. Everything that the big machine emits at full power. Everyone looked at the Bastion's control panel. The core, which had spent the entire moon learning to hide its trail, now had to bellow across the entire ocean, and it had to do so while standing still in a flooded neighborhood directly above the cocoon, motionless. At night, in a city where the moon's rule punishes even the slightest pause. Silas Moore had defected to the humans' side, organized the escape of 142 workers from the dying Moloch, and stayed behind to cover the escape route, falling into the hands of Kessler, who declared that he would flood the mountain of headlights just so the platform wouldn't fall into anyone's hands. The caravan reached Caldera, where the cocoon of the second womb glowed pink beneath the water, while Moloch, with a horde hanging halfway along its path, was already entering the harbor. Ray proposed a crazy plan. to rouse the cocoon with the noise of the core right beneath Moloch's feet, so that the mountain and the horde would clash with the new womb, allowing the caravan to seize the Arc 2 platform.
They assigned roles for the plan before sunset. The caravan, with its crew, headed for the northern spit beyond the port's limits under Irma's command.
Dorian, along with the courier and the haulers, took charge of the evacuation corridor. Tess and Mayak, via radio, prepared to dock with the platform. Meanwhile, two people were making their way through the flooded district above the cocoon. Bastion, with Ray at the wheel, and Juna handling communications because no one, not even her brother, could pry her away from him. Moloch entered the port's waters at dusk. Kessler steered the behemoth through the shallows of the outer harbor toward the mouth of the fairway, and his crew's calculations on the ridge: reach it, block it, die as a traffic jam. The horde was entering the city right behind it. The vanguard thousands were already streaming along the coastal highway, and the eastern neighborhoods of Caldera were stirring. The Bastion entered the water from the north just as darkness fell completely. The flooded industrial district stood waist-deep in water, and the vehicle moved through the streets as if through canals, pushing a wave ahead of it. A pink glow rose from the depths to the right and left. The cocoon lay beneath the entire neighborhood, not a point, a field. Ray chose a position according to the Mayak diagram, the roof of the flooded assembly hall, beneath which the glow was densest. The Bastion crawled onto the industrial overpass above the hall, and Ray cut the engine. The silence was so thick you could hear the water lapping against the armor. Juna quietly asked if he remembered that this was the first time since the start of the moon they'd stood motionless at night. Ray replied that he remembered every cell of his skin, and he activated the reset. The core screamed. The diesel engines revved to full throttle, and the external circuit channeled power into the emitter grids that Tess had been welding all the way from the ridge. Heat. Field. Vibration traveled through the overpass piles into the water, into the concrete, deep below. The machine glowed in the night like a small sun and called out. The first to arrive weren't the beasts, a voice came. Kessler saw the glow over the northern districts, understood everything instantly, and went on the air. He said the devourer was mad, that to awaken it was to kill the continent. Ray replied that the continent is killed not by the one who awakens it, but by the one who drags the horde behind him like a trail for a month. While they were speaking, the depths awoke. The glow beneath the water flickered, it went out, and then it lit up in a different color. White. The water above the neighborhood swelled into a bubble and collapsed. A wave like that from an underwater explosion surged in all directions through the flooded streets. The overpass piles began to sing, and then the entire port heard a sound that no living person had ever heard before. A low moan from beneath the earth and water that immediately made the windows in the dead neighborhoods rattle. The second womb was waking up, angry and hungry, and at the same moment the first womb responded. A counter moan echoed from the eastern highway across the entire city, and the carpet of the horde surged forward at breakneck speed. The herd sensed a stranger among its food. 1,000,000 bodies surged across the caldera, heedless of the streets. Everything that followed, Ray remembered, in fragmented bursts, like frames under a strobe light. The Bastion was retreating from the awakening neighborhood, moving on the crest of a wave, and behind them, something was rising from the water. White cables as thick as tower cranes were tearing through the roofs of the workshops from the inside. The overpass they were walking on was collapsing behind them, span by span. Juna held the communication device with both hands and led Dorian and the corridor toward them. At the exit from the neighborhoods, they were pinned down. The vanguard of the first horde surged across North Street, cutting off their path, and for the first time that night, the Bastion struck the creatures, not merely fending them off, but breaking through. Hands pounded the corridor in a living mass. Dorian's courier and the tractors burned through the flanks. It took them 8 minutes to cover 200 meters, and Ray would have gone gray if he'd had the time. They broke through. They emerged onto the embankment to the north, and they stopped because they couldn't look away. In the center of the flooded district, a second mothership was rising from the water to its full height. It was larger than the first, white, wet. It unfurled from its cocoon like a fist from a glove, and its first blow wasn't aimed at the horde. It was aimed at the largest, hottest piece of iron in its line of sight, into Malach. Kessler's mountain had just crawled up to the throat of the fairway. White cables lashed across half the port, landed on the decks, and began to pull. Kessler went full power on the backup circuit. Malach braced itself with 3 supports. It creaked loud enough for the whole city to hear, and it held firm. And then the first horde charged into it from the east. The swarm engulfed the mountain, clambered up its supports, and before the eyes of the entire caravan, 2 monsters of the moon and 1 human monster became entangled in a knot in the middle of the waterway. The monsters tore at Molus from both sides and tore at each other through him. The mountain fought back with its turrets, cranes, and hull. Kessler fought in the air, exposed, and was no longer
speaking but growling commands at the burning decks. Juna found Ray's hand and squeezed it. Ray said quietly that the window had opened and the caravan headed for the dry dock.
The dry dock lay a kilometer north of the battle node. While the 3 mountains tore each other apart, the Bastion, with Dorian's column, flew into the shipyard's territory. The Arc 2 platform stood on the slipway, massive and dark. Half its hull was covered in scaffolding. Tess and Mayak were already coordinating the docking via communications. The Bastion crawled into the slipway niche beneath the platform's belly, and the core released all the grippers at once. The system sang out the line it had been working toward for the entire moon. Stationary arc assembly detected, contours aligned, 3rd level integration initiated, and at that moment, Juna screamed, not out of fear, because of the broadcast. She switched to speakerphone, and everyone heard it. Kessler's voice, cutting through the static and the roar, called out the Devourer by name. By his real name. Ray Coulter, the voice said. The mountain is sinking. The wombs are still occupied with it for another hour. I can count, and I've counted to the end. Take the platform. Take the city. Take my people. They need someone alive. And then the voice gave the drop coordinates and said, one last thing. In the lower hold of Moloch, there's a man locked up who arranged for the workers to escape. I wanted to put him on trial this morning. There won't be a morning. If you hurry, you'll make it. The connection cut out. Integration with the platform required 6 hours of immobility. Silas had an hour at most in the sinking mountain. And between the dock and Moloch, the waters were churning with 2 hordes and 2 matrices. Ray looked at his people and realized the decision was already written all over their faces. Tess said she'd stay for docking. Dorian started up the courier. Irma drove the dump truck up to the shipyard gates. Juna took her place at communications. Heading into the thick of battle for a single person was pure madness by any lunar standard. But the caravan had long since stopped relying on the moon's arithmetic. The Bastion stood motionless all night over the cocoon at full power, waking the second mother, who immediately attacked Moloch, while the first horde, rushing to the scene, clashed with her right on Mount Kessler. While the 3 giants tore at each other in the waters, the caravan broke through to the shipyard, and the core began a 6-hour integration with the Arc 2 platform, which required it to remain motionless. Kessler conceded defeat in his own way, handed over his people and the city to Ray, and reported that Silas was locked in the hold of the sinking Moloch, after which the crew decided to venture into the thick of the battle for a single man.
A rescue team was assembled in 10 minutes using whatever could float. Tractor trucks with pontoons from the tanker, a courier on inflatable floats from the bridge over still water, and Irma's dump truck which, with water up to the cab, was simply walking along the riverbed. Ray led the group himself on the undocked arms of the Bastion.
Both arms were mounted on the pontoon frame, creating the strangest machine on the moon, a steel raft with 2 crane arms. Tess directed the operation from the platform, and her voice in the headset counted off the percentages like a pulse. The Moloch was sinking across the fairway, majestically and terrifyingly. The mountain lay on its side in deep water, and its 3 supports jutted out of the water like the fingers of a drowning man. White and gray cables crisscrossed the decks. Both queens continued to divide the spoils, and the water around the junction seethed with thousands of creatures from both hordes. They were fighting among themselves, herd against herd. The lookout on the ridge reported over the radio that he was witnessing a rare sight, the immune system devouring itself. The path to the lower holds lay through the stern breach below the waterline. Dorian found it first and led the courier into the black water inside the mountain. After that, Ray could only hear them over the radio. Felix was counting the turns. Dorian was cursing the floating workshop furniture. Then he said he could see the hold grate and beyond it, the light of a lantern. Silas was alive. Kessler's clever man had created an air pocket for himself from an overturned tank and was awaiting death with the dignity of a notary. The Bastion's hands pried open the hatch. Ray thrust both paws into the breach, following Dorian's commands blindly through 30 meters of flooded corridors and broke through the entire hold wall. The return trip took 12 minutes and was the longest of anyone's life. The mountain was settling. The corridors were shifting shape. At the exit of the breach, the courier got caught a falling crane and Dorian steered the vehicle on a single float. But he got it out. They pulled Silas onto the pontoon, pale, wet, and alive. He looked at Ray and said that the natural order of things had finally collapsed. Before, people used to abandon people for the sake of machines. Now machines carry people for the sake of people. And then, amid the roar of battle, everyone heard a new sound. Moloch straightened up. Kessler gathered the remnants of the backup circuit into a single pulse, and the mountain rose from the water one last time. Not for battle, for show. Moloch's surviving cranes swung around and clamped onto the body of the second womb in a death grip. All the turrets opened fire, point blank, and then Kessler opened the ballast valves, and 12,000 metric tons dragged the white beast to the bottom, along with them. His final transmission was brief. He said that the empire is built on bones. Let the bones at least form the foundation properly. The mountain sank beneath the water, still clinging to the second womb, and the whirlpool it created raged through the harbor for a quarter of an hour. The second womb broke free right at the bottom. The torn white carcass surfaced nearby, flung its cables onto the coastal cranes, and dragged itself out of the harbor into the open ocean, leaving a glowing trail behind it. It was heading back to where the signal had come from. Home. To lick its wounds, the first mothership did not see it off. A herd without a shepherd cannot fight, and the first horde, having lost its target, retreated from the harbor waters into the dead quarters. The mother gathered the carpet and led it away from the city to the north. Something long forgotten descended upon the harbor. Silence. The group returned to the shipyard at dawn, and the dawn was its usual yellow, not crimson. The people on the spit were the first to notice it. The blood moon hung over the horizon, pale as if faded. The lighthouse reported that the background radiation from the depths had dropped by half. The signal summoning the creatures to land was growing weaker. The ocean had received its answer from the land and was pondering. At noon, Tess reported that the integration was complete, and Ray climbed onto the platform to receive the third circuit. Arc 2 opened up before the core like a book. The program archive, blueprints of all 4 cores, maps of the test sites, and the main weapon against the cocoons, which turned out not to be a cannon. It was a silence emitter. A field generator that suppressed electromagnetic noise across an area the size of an entire city, making the land invisible to the depths. The fleet wasn't going to fight the ocean. The fleet was going to hide humanity from it. Ray stood in the platform's control center and watched as the system drew a new diagram. The Bastion was no longer a machine. The platform's core and the caravan's 40 machines were merging into a single structure. A mobile unit on wheels, and a stationary heart that could also be mounted on running supports based on the archive blueprints. The mobile state was gaining a capital. That evening at the shipyard, they buried those who had gone missing over the past day. 17 names. Irma read them aloud, and after each name, the column of machines honked its horn. Then Okafor brought a council delegation from Santa Rosa, and a conversation took place in the shipyard office that Ray remembered word for word. Okafor asked who he considered himself to be now. The owner of the continent's most powerful machine, the king of the roads. Who? Ray replied that he was a mechanic. Just a mechanic with a very large workshop now. And he added that the workshop needed rules because he had seen where owners without rules end up. He had seen it on the decks of Moloch. That night, Ray went out alone onto the slipway wall. Below, the caravan glowed with lights. In the roadstead, the water that had swallowed Kessler was growing dark. Juna found her brother there and stood silently beside him. Then she asked what he was thinking about. Ray told her the truth. He was thinking that somewhere on the continent, according to the Mayak documents, there were 3 more assembly corps. Sleeping. Waiting for someone's blood on the torn metal, and about the fact that the second womb had gone into the ocean alive, which meant the depths now knew about the land, and that was the main thing. Something had appeared on land that could awaken and kill her children. The moon was fading, but the story wasn't over. The story had only just begun. Ray's team pulled Silas from the hold of the sinking Moloch, while Kessler, in a last-ditch effort, clamped his cranes onto the second womb, opened the Kingstons, and dragged it to the bottom, where it broke free and, wounded, fled into the ocean. After which, the first womb led the horde out of the city. The integration was complete. The Corps received its 3rd circuit, the ARC program archive, the blueprints for the 3 remaining cores, and the primary weapon, the silence emitter, which conceals the land from the depths. The blood moon began to fade. The caravan gained a capital. The platform was buried. 17 of the dead were laid to rest, and Ray declared that the state needed rules, not a ruler. 100 days passed, and the world learned to measure time anew, not by the moon, from silence. The caravan remained on the move near the caldera for the entire first month, while the platform was erected on its supports based on the blueprints from the archives. Arc 2 took its first step on the 100th day anniversary, and 5,000 people witnessed that step. The capital, weighing 20,000 metric tons, moved along the coastal highway at a pedestrian's pace, and the city moved in rings around it. The outer ring of patrols, the ring of residential platforms, a ring of workshops. People simply called it all the March, a state that never stops. The silence emitter had been operating since the first week, and the roads were changing before our eyes. Within the field's radius, creatures went blind. They didn't die or leave immediately. They simply stopped sensing. Hunters roamed the roadsides like sleepwalkers, stumbling upon empty houses and gradually retreating beyond the field's boundary to where the old hum of the world still rang out. The march swept across the continent, dragging behind it a strip of cleared land 100 kilometers wide. Within that strip, people spent the night in houses for the first time, cautiously, with their cars parked by the porch, but they spent the night. Santa Rosa became the first hub of the new network. Okafor signed an agreement with the march, one drafted by the entire council, and Ray insisted on the first clause. No person may be entered on any list without their own signature. Silas drafted the text personally and said that, for the first time, his accounting department was calculating correctly. By the 60th day, there were 4 hubs. By the 100th, there were 7. The hod traveled between them along a circular route, like blood flowing between organs, carrying iron, people's food, and silence. The cores were found sooner than expected. The first one was retrieved, according to Mayak's documents, from the northern test site in one piece, and Tess personally activated it with a drop of a volunteer's blood. Irma became the volunteer. Her core grew into a heavy road cruiser, and Irma took it to build the second path on the western highways. They said their goodbyes without words. She said only that Ray had been right back then on the sandbar. Dead machines are more honest than living people. But living people with honest machines, that's something new. The second core was found already awakened. On the southeastern roads, a machine had been taking shape for half a year, built by a sullen loner, a former soldier named Gray, who retraced Ray's path, but more ruthlessly and in less time. The encounter between the two devourers nearly turned into a war until Ray did something Gray hadn't expected. He opened the archive to him completely. All the blueprints, all the maps, the whole truth about the depths. He said that the secret that makes one person strong kills everyone else. Gray thought it over for a week, traveling on a parallel course. Then he docked his cruiser in the outer ring of the passage, and from that point on, the southern patrols knew of no breaches. The fourth core was never found. His test site remained flooded, and the lighthouse assumed the worst possible outcome, that the depths were also capable of dismantling foreign mechanisms. Ray reread that line in the archive more often than any other. The ocean remained silent for all 100 days. The second womb did not return. The first had carried the carpet off to the northern wastelands, where the horde was slowly dwindling without a signal for replenishment. The blood moon had faded to a pale scar in the sky, and the children born in the spring no longer understood why the elders shuddered at the color red. But Ray wouldn't let Hod believe the story was over. At every council meeting, he repeated the beacon's words. Silence is not victory. Silence is a cloak of invisibility. The depth is alive, it is wise, and one day it will come to see where the splinter has gone. Hod must meet that day on wheels. Over the course of 100 days, Juna grew into who she had always been. Hod's communications hub, right at her fingertips, became the continent's nervous system, and Calder's call sign was known on every road. Dorian commanded the evacuation service and pulled stranded convoys out of any hole. Felix taught the children to drive. Tess headed what the documents called the Assembly Institute, but in reality, a workshop of wonders. And her students were already assembling small third-generation cores from archived blueprints. Peaceful, construction-grade, toothless, Tess said that a machine should be capable of more than just eating. On the 101st day, Hod took Eastern Highway 9. Ray recognized the road by the crack in the sign. Ashford had stood here. The city had died like all cities, but the stadium had survived, and the Hod set up a day camp around it. Ray walked to the distribution area. He stood where the line used to be. Where Vale had laughed as he handed him the keys. Where Dorian had placed the canister on his deathbed. The rusty van no longer existed. Its metal had been dissolved into the body of the Capitol, weighing 20,000 metric tons. But Ray carried one thing with him. On the first day of integration, the core had expelled a small object as inedible. The van's ignition key with a worn-out delivery service keychain. Ray drove a ship-grade steel post into the edge of the site and hung the key on it. Tess welded a plaque, and on the plaque was exactly what Ray had dictated. Here, a person has drawn the worst lot. Check your lot twice. In the evening, a spontaneous gathering formed around the post, and people waited for a speech. Ray wasn't good at speeches. He said 3 sentences. He said that the moon had taken people's homes away, but in return had taught them the main rule that was worth all the lost walls. Whoever moves, lives. It's just that before, people thought this was about cars, but it had always been about people. That night, Hod left the camp and headed east toward the new hub. Ray sat in the Capitol's control center, but his hands weren't on the control panel. They were on the old steering wheel that Tess had welded into the main console, defying all the schematics. The steering wheel was from a delivery van. Juna brought 2 mugs and sat down next to him, just as she used to in the cab of her father's pickup truck when she was a child. Below, beneath the armor, the diesel engines hummed. Ahead, in the darkness, lay a continent full of roads. The lights of the convoy stretched 20 kilometers beyond the capital, and from the ridge it looked like a river of light flowing through dead land. The river did not stop. The river knew the rule. Ray finished his mug, looked east where dawn was breaking without a single hint of red, and for the first time in history allowed himself to think the word in its entirety. Home. Home was traveling at a speed of 40 kilometers per hour, and that was enough. In 100 days, the caravan had become the march a mobile state centered around the striding capital, Arc 2, which as an emitter of silence, purifies the continent and binds the 7 hub cities by a treaty where no one can be added to the lists without a signature. 2 of the 3 cores had been found. Irma led the western, the lone walker, Gray joined the patrols, while the fate of the 4th submerged core remained an unsettling mystery, as did the 2nd womb that had survived in the ocean. Ray hung the key to the rusty van on a memorial post in dead Ashford and summed it up. The rule is, whoever moves is alive. Has always been about people, and the story ended with the image of a house traveling east at a speed of 40 kilometers per hour. A rescue team was assembled in 10 minutes from whatever could float. tractor trailers with pontoons made from tanker tanks, a courier on inflatable floats from the bridge over still water, and Irma's dump truck, which, with water up to the cab, was simply walking along the riverbed. Ray led the group himself on the undocked arms of the Bastion. Both arms were mounted on the pontoon frame, creating the strangest vehicle on the moon, a steel raft with 2 crane arms. Just before they set out, an argument broke out that Ray hadn't expected. Juna demanded a spot on the pontoon, and for the first time he said no to his sister. He said that the Hod's communications were more important than any 2 hands, and if the group didn't return, someone would have to complete the integration and lead the people away. Juna looked at him for a long time. Then, without a word, she hung her backup channel headset around his neck and walked over to the control panel. It was a farewell just in case, and they both knew it. Tess was overseeing the integration from the platform, and her voice in his earpiece was counting off the percentages like a pulse. 12, 13. Each percentage point meant that the core was sinking deeper into the slipway, and the caravan's heart was growing ever more helpless. Moloch was sinking across the fairway, majestically and terrifyingly. The mountain had tilted onto its side in deep water, and its 3 supports jutted out of the water like the fingers of a drowning man. White and gray ropes scurried across the decks. Both queens continued to divide the spoils, and the water around the knot seethed with thousands of creatures from both hordes. They were fighting each other, horde against horde. The gray hunters were tearing the white newborns from their cocoons, while the whites were slicing the grays in half. The lighthouse on the ridge announced over the airwaves that it was witnessing a rare sight. The immune system was devouring itself. Irma led the dump truck first along the bottom of the harbor, carving a path between the fighting swarms. The creatures, preoccupied with each other, did not notice the vehicles moving at a slow speed with their exhaust systems turned off. The lesson from the flooded neighborhood had worked. There was no such thing as cold or quiet at that depth. The path to the lower holds ran through a breach in the stern below the waterline. Dorian found it first and led the courier into the black water inside the mountain. After that, Ray could only hear them over the comm. Felix was counting the turns. Dorian was cursing at the floating workshop furniture. At one point, both of them fell silent for a full minute, and Ray had time to die inside before Felix said they'd passed the flooded barracks, and that it was best never to shine a flashlight there on anyone ever. Then Dorian said he could see the hold grate and a light behind it. Silas was alive. Kessler's clever man had created an air pocket for himself out of an overturned tanker and was awaiting death with the dignity of a notary. He wasn't even surprised by the visitors. He merely remarked that, according to his calculations, the rescuers had a 4% chance of success, and he was glad that the math continued to err on the side of accuracy. The grating was pried open by the Bastion's arms. Ray thrust both paws into the opening, following Dorian's commands blindly through 30 meters of flooded corridors. The fingers on the remote control lived a life of their own. He sensed the steel of the corridors through the resistance of the actuators, just as a blind man senses the street with his cane. The grippers seized the hold wall and tore it out entirely, along with the frame. The return trip took 12 minutes and was the longest in the lives of all those involved. The mountain was settling. The corridors were changing shape. The bulkheads burst at the welds with a sound like gunshots. As they exited the breach, the courier was caught by a falling crane, and Dorian steered the vehicle on a single float, scooping out water with Felix's helmet. But he made it out. Silas was lifted onto the pontoon, pale, wet, and alive. He looked at Ray and said that the natural order of things had finally collapsed. Before, people would abandon people for the sake of machines. Now machines carried people for the sake of people. And then, amid the roar of battle, everyone heard a new sound. Moloch straightened up. Kessler gathered the remnants of the backup circuit into a single pulse, and the mountain rose from the water one last time. Not for battle, for a gesture, water poured from its decks in cascades, and in the light of the burning superstructures, the mountain resembled a man who had risen from his knees to deliver a final word. Moloch's surviving cranes swiveled and clamped onto the body of the second womb in a death grip. All the turrets opened fire at point-blank range, and then Kessler opened the ballast valves, and 12,000 metric tons dragged the white monster down to the bottom with them. His final transmission was brief, and Ray remembered it word for word because it contained neither anger nor fear. Kessler said that an empire is built on bones. Let the bones at least form the foundation properly. Then he added more quietly, as if to himself, that the mechanic from Ashford had been right about one thing. A swarm of machines is not yet a civilization. Civilization is what a pack is willing to drown for. The connection was cut off by the water. The mountain sank beneath the waves, clinging to the mothership, and the whirlpool it created raged through the harbor for a quarter of an hour, rocking the pontoons and scattering the fighting creatures across the water. The second mothership broke free, right at the bottom. Its torn white hull surfaced nearby, flung its cables onto the shore cranes, and dragged itself out of the harbor into the open ocean, leaving a glowing trail behind it. It was heading back toward where the signal had come from, home, to lick its wounds. The lighthouse guided it by instruments as long as it could and reported that the trail had disappeared beyond the shelf into the depths. The first mother refused to see her rival off. A herd cannot fight without an enemy, and the first horde, having lost its target, retreated from the harbor into the dead quarters. The queen gathered the herd like a shepherd gathers sheep after a storm and led it away from the city to the north. The creatures left the caldera before noon in a continuous gray stream, and the people on the spit watched this exodus in silence. Something long forgotten descended upon the port. Silence, true silence, without the rustle of ropes on the ground. The group returned to the shipyard, and the dawn they met was the usual yellow, not crimson. The people on the spit were the first to notice it. The blood moon hung over the horizon, pale as a faded photograph of itself. The lighthouse reported that the background radiation from the depths had dropped by half in a single night. The signal summoning the creatures to land was growing weaker. The ocean had received its answer from the land and was pondering. At noon, Tess reported that the integration was complete, and Ray climbed onto the platform to receive the third circuit. Arc 2 opened up before the core like a book, the program's archive, the weights of all 4 cores, test site maps, personal files of the program's engineers, half of whom were listed as missing on the first night, and the main weapon against the cocoons, which turned out not to be a cannon. It was a silence emitter, a field generator that suppressed electromagnetic noise across an area the size of an entire city, making the land invisible to the depths. The fleet wasn't going to fight the ocean. The fleet was going to hide humanity from it. Tess read the specifications twice and said she now understood the entire moon. For 30 years, people had been bellowing into the depths with all their metal and were surprised when the depths answered. Ray stood in the platform's control center and watched as the system drew a new diagram. The Bastion was no longer a machine. The platform's core and the caravan's 40 machines merged into a single circuit. A mobile node on wheels, and a stationary heart that could also be mounted on running supports based on the archive blueprints. The mobile state was gaining a capital. That evening at the shipyard, they buried those who had gone missing over the past day, 17 names. Irma read them aloud, and after each name, the column of machines honked its horn. Silas stood in the general ranks, wearing someone else's dry clothes, and when the name of a guy from his former squad who had died on the dam many weeks ago and whom Ray himself had added to the list was called out, he covered his eyes with his hand. Then Okafor brought a council delegation from Santa Rosa, and a conversation took place in the shipyard office that Ray remembered word for word. Okafor asked who he considered himself to be now, the owner of the continent's most powerful machine, the king of the roads. Who? Ray replied that he was a mechanic, just a mechanic who now had a very large workshop, and he added that the workshop needed rules because he'd seen where owners without rules end up. He'd seen it on the decks of the Malak. Okafor nodded and placed a blank sheet of paper on the table. She said the rules had to be written now or never, while the metal still remembered its price. That night, Ray went out alone onto the slipway wall. Below, the caravan glowed with lights. In the roadstead, the water that had swallowed Kessler grew dark. Somewhere beneath that water lay a mountain that had wanted to rule over everything. and in its final hour had chosen to give it all up. Juna found her brother there and stood silently beside him. She returned his headset to him and took hers back. Then she asked what he was thinking about. Ray told her the truth. He was thinking that somewhere on the continent, according to Mayak's records, there were 3 more assembly cores, sleeping, waiting for someone's blood on the torn metal, and about the fact that the second womb had gone into the ocean alive, which meant the depths now knew about the land, and that was the main thing. Something had appeared on land that could awaken and kill its children. The moon was fading, but the story wasn't over. History had only just learned to move. Ray's group made their way along the harbor floor through the war between the 2 hordes and pulled Silas from the hold of the sinking mountain. Meanwhile, Kessler, in a final burst of energy, clamped his cranes onto the second womb, opened the Kingston valves, dragged it to the bottom, and bid farewell with the words that civilization is what for which the pack is willing to drown. The wounded second womb drifted out into the ocean. The first led the horde north. Integration was complete, and the core received its 3rd circuit, the archive, the blueprints of the 3 remaining cores, and the emitter of silence concealing the land from the depths. They buried the 17 who had perished. Okafor began writing the rules of the new order with Ray, and the moon began to fade. 100 days passed, and the world learned to measure time anew, not by the moon, but by silence. The caravan remained on the move near Caldera for the entire first month, while the platform was erected on supports based on the archive blueprints. Work continued around the clock, and an entire generation of new craftsmen emerged on the slipway. Former workers from Kessler's sheet metal shop welded the support joints, and Tess said she'd never seen people pour so much of themselves into iron. Silas explained the reason to her in a single sentence. For the first time, these people are building something that can't be taken away from them. Arc 2 took its first step on the anniversary of the 100th day, and 5,000 people witnessed that step. The capital, weighing 20,000 metric tons, moved along the coastal highway at a pedestrian's pace, and the city moved in rings around it. The outer ring of patrols, the ring of residential platforms, the ring of workshops. People simply called it all the March, a state that never stops. The silence emitter had been operating since the first week, and the roads were changing before their eyes. Within the radius of the field, creatures went blind. They didn't die or leave immediately. They simply stopped sensing. The hunters wandered along the roadsides like sleepwalkers, stumbling upon empty houses and gradually retreating beyond the field's boundary, to where the old noise of the world still rang out. The advance swept across the continent, dragging behind it a strip of cleared land 100 kilometers wide. Within that strip, people spent the night in their homes for the first time, cautiously, with cars parked by the porch, with someone on watch by the radio. But they spent the night. Ray didn't sleep at all on that first night. He stood on the armored vehicle and listened as windows lit up in the dead settlement by the highway, and a woman cried with laughter. Her son had made his bed in a room for the first time in his life, rather than in the back of a truck. Santa Rosa became the first hub of the new network. Okafor signed an agreement with the March, which had been drafted by the entire council, and Ray insisted on the first clause. No person may be listed on any document without their own signature. Silas drafted the text himself, 40 pages, whittled down to 12, and said that for the first time, his accounting was adding up correctly. Juna wrote the second clause. Every node in the network is required to keep the airwaves open because silence has killed more people than beasts. Irma dictated the third clause from atop a dump truck. The machine moves around people, not people around the machine. By the 60th day, there were 4 nodes. By the 100th, there were 7. The flow moved between them along a circular route, like blood between organs, carrying iron, people's food, and silence. The cores were found sooner than expected. The first one was retrieved intact based on Mayak's documents at the northern test site, and Tess personally awakened it with a drop of a volunteer's blood. Irma became the volunteer. Her core grew into a heavy road cruiser within a month, retracing the Bastion's path without a single mistake. because now the mistakes were described in the textbook Tess wrote at night. Irma led the cruiser to build a second path on the western highways, and 60 volunteers, including Felix, went with her. They said their goodbyes without speeches. She said only that Ray had been right back then on the shoal. Dead machines are more honest than a living people, but living people with honest machines, that's something new. They found the second core already awake. On the southeastern roads, a vehicle belonging to a sullen loner, a former soldier named Gray, had been making its way for half a year, retracing Ray's route, but more fiercely and more quickly. His vehicle was all angles and barrels and had not a single living compartment. Gray ate, slept, and fought alone in the cockpit. The encounter between the two devourers on a neutral highway nearly turned into a war. The vehicles stood facing each other for an hour, and Juna later admitted that it was the first time she'd ever felt silence weigh a ton. Ray did something Gray hadn't expected. He opened the archives to him completely. All the blueprints, all the maps, the whole truth about the depth, and about the fact that the cores weren't built for war between humans. He said that the secret that makes one strong kills everyone else. Gray thought about it for a week, traveling on a parallel course within sight. On the 8th day, his cruiser took up a position in the outer ring of the passage for night patrol duty, and from that point on, the southern patrols knew no breaches. Gray spoke little, but one day at the dock, he approached Tess and asked for the blueprint of the living quarters. He said he'd picked up 2 orphans along the way and that the cockpit was too cramped for them. They never found the 4th core. Its test site lay submerged by the tides, and Mayak feared the worst. That the depths, too, were capable of dismantling foreign mechanisms and learning from them. Ray reread this line in the archives more often than any other and ordered that the patrols of all the hordes record in the log any mechanism that moved without humans. The logs remained empty for now. For now, the ocean had been silent for all 100 days. The second womb had not returned. The first had carried the carpet off to the northern wastelands, and the horde there was slowly dwindling without a signal for replenishment. Scouts reported that the creatures at the edge of the field of silence had grown lethargic and were already being hunted by feral dogs. The world was unfolding anew with the audacity of grass sprouting through asphalt. The blood moon had faded to a pale scar in the sky, and the children born in the spring no longer understood why the elders shuddered at the color red. But Ray wouldn't let Hod believe the story was over. At every council meeting, he repeated the words of the beacon, "Silence is not victory. Silence is an invisibility cloak. The depth is alive, it is intelligent, and one day it will come to see where the splinter has gone. Hod must meet that day on wheels and with schools full of mechanics." In 100 days, Juna grew into who she had always been. Hod's communications hub, under her control, became the continent's nervous system, and Calder's call sign was known on every road. She led the morning briefings for all the hubs and ended each one with a single phrase. The airwaves are open. Speak. And people spoke. They searched for loved ones. They traded diesel for seeds. They read poetry. The continent was learning to make itself heard again, only now its noise traveled through wires and didn't stir the depths. Dorian commanded the evacuation service and pulled stranded convoys out of any hole. The man who once bought a lottery ticket for a can of fuel now followed his own rule. When a call for help came in, his courier would be the first to respond, and for free. Silas mediated between the nodes and was considered the network's most honest arbiter, because a man who had seen the depths of accounting firsthand could smell it a mile away. Tess headed what was called the Assembly Institute in the documents, but was, in reality, a workshop of wonders. Her students were already assembling small third-generation cores from archived blueprints. Peaceful, constructive, toothless. Tess used to say that a machine should be capable of more than just eating. They had gifted the first small core to Santa Rosa, and it was now building the city, expanding the walls to accommodate real neighborhoods. On the 101st day, the horde set out on Eastern Highway number 9. Ray recognized the road by the crack in the sign. Ashford stood here. The city had died, like all cities, but the stadium had survived, and Hod set up a day camp around it. Ray arrived at the distribution site on foot without guards or an entourage. He stood where the line used to be, where Vale had laughed as he handed him the keys. Vale had been found on the list of survivors from the southern hub 2 weeks ago, and Ray had ordered that no one tell him who was leading the horde. Let him find out for himself. Someday at the pole, where Dorian had placed the canister to kill him, there was now nothing but grass sprouting through the concrete. The rusty van no longer existed. Its metal had been dissolved into the body of the capital, weighing 20,000 metric tons. Every beam of the walk carried within it atoms of that trough that the line had laughed at. But Ray carried one thing with him. On the first day of integration, the core had expelled a small object as inedible. The van's ignition key with a worn-out delivery service keychain. Tess had said then that the system never makes mistakes and considers only that which is more important than mass to be inedible. Ray drove a ship-grade steel post into the edge of the site and hung the key on it. Tess welded a plaque, and on the plaque was exactly what Ray had dictated. Here, a person had drawn the worst lot. Check your lot twice. In the evening, a spontaneous gathering formed around the post, and people waited for a speech. Ray wasn't good at speeches. He said 3 sentences. He said that the moon had taken people's homes away, but in return had taught them the most important rule, one worth all the lost walls. Those who keep moving stay alive. It's just that people used to think this applied to machines. But it had always been about people. The crowd was silent. Then an old man with a gray face, the very one who had once described the horde as a carpet, stretching to the horizon, took off his hat and bowed to the pillar. The others began to take off their hats after him. That night, Hod left the camp and headed east toward the new hub. Ray sat in the capital's control center, but his hands were not on the control panel. They rested on the old steering wheel that Tess had welded into the main console, defying all schematics and common sense. The steering wheel was from a delivery van. It wasn't connected to anything. It was connected to the main system. Juna brought 2 mugs and sat down next to him, just as she had once done as a child in the cab of her father's pickup truck. She asked if he remembered how his father used to say that the road itself decides whom to carry. Ray replied that his father was wrong. The road doesn't decide anyone's fate. The road just lies there. It's the driver who decides. Below, beneath the armor, the diesel engines of the locomotive and the ship sang in unison, fused into a single heart. Ahead, in the darkness, lay a continent full of roads, and on those roads, for the first time in a long while, there were more lights than creatures. The lights of the march stretched 20 kilometers beyond the capital, and from the ridge it looked like a river of light flowing through the dead land. The river didn't stop, the river knew the rule. Ray finished his mug, looked eastward, where the morning was turning gray without a single hint of red, and for the first time in his entire life allowed himself to think the word in its entirety. Home. Home was traveling at a speed of 40 kilometers per hour. Home was carrying 5,000 people, a school, a workshop, and the memory of all those who hadn't made it. And that was enough. That was more than enough.